Hi, everybody. I'm Rudyard Lynch with our co-host Austin Paget, and today's video will be on the creation of Eastern Europe.
Very exciting. And it turns out my mic was not connected last week. It connected to my webcam. It's not connected this week either. I need fancy cables. So
You don't
I'm going to keep it here because it looks cool, but it doesn't work.
you don't tell them that stuff. You just talk into the mic and see if they can figure it out.
Oh,
Uh,
they know. The
no,
ones that know. This is for the ones that know. The ones that are getting woken up by my sudden loud audio bursts.
the audience picks up on really weird details, and then it doesn't pick up on other obvious things. I've been doing this for over a decade. I'll be shocked that the audience picks up on certain oh, you got this thing wrong. And then they don't pick up on an obvious subtext thing of something that's unstated, but it's implicit in the video. Um, I'm gonna put three asides before we get started. First of all, is that the lot next to me is doing construction. Zoom is normally good at cutting that out, but I apologize if there's any background noise. Uh, Secondly, is I'm seeing floaties now, which is something where in my perceptual frame I'll see sort of floating lights. Um, Normally, or sometimes they're the presage to migraines, and I've taught you enough stuff. I'll take these editorial asides as sort of debt I've incurred, but I'll get these migraines where I go blind for 3 to 4 hours, and then I'll have stabbing pains in my head and my stomach. I haven't had them in years, but I'll get sort of the presages of them. I think I'm going to be fine for this video. I haven't had one in a while, but if I'm sort of loopy, that's why. Normally, once I get into these videos, I can feel a sort of rhythm, and then once I ride the rhythm, a lot of that other stuff goes away. And the third thing is this is a time period that people will have a very strong urge to believe is boring, but in fact is not. And I stand by that is similar to the medieval Islam video, where our era of history does not know how to write topics like this. And so when you think of the creation of Poland or Russia or the Balkan countries, we imagine it in the most dryly written historic way possible. And it's comparable between a lot of the Middle Ages where we don't know how to write it. The Middle Ages is too religious, it's too personal, it's too all of these given things. And so we default back onto doing dates and sort of this leader did blank thing in blank year. But what that leaves out is the human character of the history, where when you look at Eastern Europe in that time period, you saw the formation of these countries. And each of these countries had a wildly different frame of life than the others. And what I mean by that is that when we look at them, we see these countries as similar sort of places on the map. Especially if you're an American, Americans have a tendency to sort of flatten the rest of the world.
Mhm.
But when you look at Hungary or Poland or Ukraine or Russia, these were societies that each had a wildly different social structure and a wildly different background that were pitted in a battle royale against one another. And so when you're looking at Eastern Europe in this time period, you're seeing the attempt to form a potential world civilization that did not in fact happen. Where Eastern Europe had the potential to become a world civilization, I believe on the scale of the West, the Middle East, India, or China, but it ultimately failed in that aim. We will not talk about why it failed in this video. This is a video about the ethnogenesis of the Eastern European nations. And ethnogenesis is a Latin term for the national formation. And this is something that's nearly entirely written out, where when Westerners do perceive Eastern European history, they look at the age of empires, which is what we'll cover next, or the 20th century, which both sort of in retrospect betray these kind of grim visions of the time period where because you see the push towards the total state and this area's gutting, but when you're looking at the medieval establishment of these countries, you're seeing the buildup of a potential that was never realized.
Kind of like a Western European civilization with an Eastern European skin, like their same interpretation of a similar value set through their national identity with the various kind of differences on show. And we never really got to see it because they got subsumed into the Soviet Union, and we don't have to think about their national characteristics because they didn't make us think about it. They're not super relevant, but Eastern Europe is getting more relevant and it has a ton of potential. Is what part of it exactly you're talking about, but there's a lot of potential. So maybe we'll start to see what those nations would have looked like if they form along Western values in the 21st century. Western values being like the broad Christendom, interpreted through East and West.
In this video, we're going to cover the period from the formation of the Slavs until the development of the social structure of the countries that led into the dissolution of Poland-Lithuania between Prussia, Austria, Poland, Russia, and then also the Balkans. And we're not actually going to end with the dissolution of Poland-Lithuania into those three different countries. Instead, we are going to look to when those countries formed cohesive social structures and they became the societies that could later develop into the age of empires. And each of these distinct societies were based on wildly different trajectories about how they formed their society. Because Eastern Europe was a wild east, where there was too much space with not enough people. And so each of these societies on an individual basis had to figure out, how do we construct our social structure in a manner that is independent from the others, because we have to figure this out from scratch. Where the western half of Europe, they had the sort of luxury of Roman colonization, which is that's something that would have made sense in the 19th century. It would be totally taboo to say, where France and Italy and Spain, and even the English or the Germans, through sort of mirror images of Rome, had a model of state construction from Rome, and multiple Eastern European regimes claimed descent from Rome, but that was functionally not what they were doing. And so, to start this story, the Germans were a population that stretched from the Caucasus a little bit with the Alani people through Ukraine and Belarus and Poland across most of Eastern Europe, as well as Hungary and Romania. And we talk about that more so in the Völkerwanderung video, where during the Roman period, the Germans migrated from Denmark across Eastern Europe. But what happened with the Hun migration into Europe, which came from Asia, rupturing through the continent, building their base around Budapest, and reaching out to France and Italy, is that the Germans got pushed west into the former Roman Empire. And different German peoples populated there. But this created a pressure movement where Eastern Europe had a truly vast amount of migrations before the rise of the Germans, where you had the Scythians or the Aryans of the corded ware culture, or there were Greek colonies, whatever. And so the region was able to do that because it was very lightly populated. The Romans would talk about taking days to walk across Germany with no end of the forest. In Eastern Europe was even more lightly populated. It's important to see the way Eastern Europe was back then to the way Canada is today. Where if you drive across any stretch of Canada besides central Ontario, you'll just see infinite forest that goes on forever with periodic settlement. And that's how Eastern Europe was. So when you're seeing these various barbarian peoples push up against each other, remember that these were all semi-nomadic, semi-hunter-gatherer, semi-farming peoples. The peoples of Eastern Europe straddled this line between all three ways of life. And they would migrate to a place for a generation, use up all the soil, migrate somewhere else, wait for the soil to come back up. And so you could see these entire populations migrate over huge areas because they were already semi-nomadic. And the fall of the Hunnish Empire, which was built around the charisma of a handful of great leaders, including Attila, when that died, it meant there was this huge power vacuum in Eastern Europe where the Germans had been pushed west, and the Slavs filled this incredibly rapidly. And the Slavs were sort of a dark horse of the Volker wandering period because you're inclined to think about the Germans or the Arabs as these sort of charismatic political events. The Germans have like the glorious Viking longships and the sack of Rome. The Arabs have the Prophet Muhammad and an entire religion. But for the Slavs, they were right place, right time, and then they filled the void really quickly, and they grappled onto it. And the Slavs were slightly known to old Roman authors, where the Romans had a sense of the world where the Mediterranean was the oikumene, or the known world. And the further you got away from the Mediterranean, the more savage you were. And the Chinese were sort of the Chinese knew the Romans knew the Chinese were equivalently advanced, but they were so far away they had their own rules. And so the Romans put the Slavs in the same categories as the Finns and the bottom of Ethiopia. They said the Slavs are utter savages who live up by the frozen north. They live in animal skins, and all these things. And the Slavs were, alongside the Finno-Ugrians, they were the European peoples who had been least attached to the the larger civilizations in Europe, where the Germans were equivalently savage before the birth of Christ, and then over time they had sort of integrated into the Roman system. But when the Slavs migrated across this huge area, they were not literate. They did not do full-time agriculture. They were pagans. They did not have government structures. They did not have a warrior nobility. I don't even think they had a legal code. So they were one of the more primitive peoples in Europe because they started around the Pripyat Marsh area of North Ukraine, north of the Germans, and they were the sort of the henchmen a lot of these nomadic confederacies, because the Avars or the Huns or these peoples, they needed these large populations to help out their small cavalry armies, where some estimates think there were at least 4 and at most like 8 to 12 slaves for every warrior in the Hun Empire, because the Huns would have these huge slave populations so that when the warrior goes out into battle, he can just fight, and then the slaves take care of him, they supply him with an income, they take care of the horse. And that was the sort of Hun aristocracy. And so the Slavs did that for first the Hun Confederacy, and then the Avar Confederacy, which were we think the Huns were Finno-Ugrian, we think the Avars were Turkic, and they settled in the same area around Hungary. And then the Bulgars after, who were another Finno-Ugrian group who came off the steppe, but then they went into the Balkans. And so the Slavs migrated across a huge area of Eastern Europe in the 5th and 6th centuries. And they went through the Balkans, down to down to the Peloponnese or the bottom of Greece. And there's been a whole debate in history departments about are the ethnic Greeks actually Greek or are they ethnically Slav? And the genetics say there's a significant Slav component, but they're mostly ethnically Greek. And the Slavs also, starting around Ukraine, went west into Austria, Czechia, Brandenburg, or the area of Germany around Berlin, and then Poland. And so after their initial diaspora, the Slavs were actually further west than they are today, and the Germans went through a medieval process of pushing the Slavs back east.
Right. So that German re-pushing into that territory was actually kind of a reclamation of an earlier time. I
Yes,
mean, the things always go back further than you think. Uh, I
especially
wonder if there were roads through those massive forests. Were there ever forest roads, or did you just have to go completely around?
roads involve advanced societies to build them. They did not have that. There were no cities, no roads. The only trade systems were like fur pelts and amber and slaves.
Wow, and I guess they carried those on horses instead of wagons, or on boats through the rivers.
Keep
And
in
do you think the space prevented them from having to kind of develop into more of a stable cities?
Civilization in Europe started in the Mediterranean. So keep in mind this is an era where England and Germany are mostly forest. So it's
Hmm.
not that Eastern Europe failed, it's that they were just further away from the original central area of civilization.
Oh, and when you said they considered them more kind of barbaric than Western Europe, that applies more post-Roman conquest of Western Europe, basically, which gets back to your original framing.
Yeah, because the Germans had been in proximity with the Romans for centuries, and
Mm,
they had
right.
since become soldiers in the Roman military, bureaucrats in the Roman government system, merchants, even generals and administrators. And it was perfectly normal for the German nobility to speak Greek and Latin, to read the classics, and to be Christian. So that the Germans at the time of the birth of Christ were as to slightly less barbaric than the Slavs were 500 years later. But by the time you get to the fall of Rome, where we're talking, the Germans had moved themselves up, where in a lot of metrics, the Germans were equivalently advanced to more advanced than the Romans. And the Slavs had never gone through that process because they were north of the German area, where the
Hmm.
Eastern Europe's connection to civilization was the Greeks had colonies in Crimea that went back before the Axial Age into like the 6th century BC. So the Greeks have, if any country in the world wants to claim Crimea, the Greeks have the best bet. Um,
That's funny.
and uh, and then the Germans, originally it was Iranic peoples like the Scythians and the Sarmatians, and then the Germans, and then the Slavs. And so the Slavs could fill the void because everyone else in the Volker-Wanderung game had kind of been beaten up. The Byzantine Balkans used to be one of the most important places on earth. They got genocided by the Huns. The Germans got pushed west by the Huns. The Huns had self imploded. And so, because the Slavs were on the edge of the board, they could populate all of Eastern Europe or a significant part of it without in this critical juncture, and then the Slavs held onto the terrain and then populated it, that's a real accomplishment. It is genuinely impressive that the Slavs have held Eastern Europe for the 1500 years since, because they are basically the only population in Eastern Europe that has done that. All of
Right, and they basically had scattered, movable settlements with cavalry going in between, reinforced with foot soldiers in the population areas. So it's kind of like a flexible, flat plain strategic setup.
the the Slavs weren't really strategic about it. And to go through the different areas, so you have West Slavs, And you have East Slavs and you have South Slavs, and these are different. West Slavs are Poles and Czechs and Wends. The Wends were the Slavic population around Brandenburg or Berlin. The South Slavs were the Serbs, Bosnians, Croats, Yugoslavia Slavs. Hungarians are genetically mostly Slavic, although they speak a Turkic language. The Magyars or the Hungarians have not yet entered this region. And then the East Slavs are the former Rus, or the Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians. And there's varying degrees. A Pole is somewhat intelligible to Ukrainian. The Slavs are significantly closer to each other genetically and culturally than the Germanic peoples are, or the Latin peoples are. So because the Slavs had a more recent migration and they had a smaller genetic pool at their origin, even though the area where the Slavs did genetically mix was the Balkans. Most of the Balkan areas are half Slavic, half local ancestry. Um, and and so even if you look at a Russian and a Serb, they know that they're genetically and culturally cousins, which is why Serb and Russian nationalists have so often worked together. Where the Slavs have had a pan-Slavic current in the late 19th and early 20th century in a way the Latins or the Germans did not.
It's almost like you could say they kept fighting each other longer than everybody else because obviously the Celts always used to fight the Celts and the Germanic people would fight each other. But the Celts kind of got pushed against Rome, and I don't know. It feels like they stopped killing each other quite as often as the Slavs did later, which I guess fits with the pattern of them developing later.
I'm not I'm not sure how agentic players the Slavs were here, if I'm honest. That's kind of mean for me to say. But in so up in the north,
Mm.
they were repopulating areas like modern Canada with a handful of German tribes that migrated out. Then there were Turkic nomadic confederacies that conquered areas, used Slavs as their majority populations that they would exploit, and then the nomadic confederacies died and the Slavs took over. So you have the Avar Confederacy around Hungary, and
Mm.
they were originally great warriors, but then they settled into Hungary, and Hungary is this miniature grassland of the Eurasian steppe that's wedged into the European forests. And so it's been this microcosm that's allowed these steppe peoples to attack outwards and reach as far as France or Italy, and that's been true of both the Huns and the Magyars. Um, and so the Avars eventually grew decadent and soft, and they built a series of forts called the Ring. And Charlemagne destroyed the Ring and took the Avar gold. That was considered one of the wealthiest treasures on Earth, that's like something out of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, or a fantasy novel, or it's another example of something that would make a good movie. Like
Yeah,
all that gold at the end, like like National Treasure plus Kingdom of Heaven.
yeah. Um, and so the Avars were around the Hungarian plain, and then the Bulgars smashed into the Byzantine Balkans. And the Byzantine Balkans were depopulated by the Huns. They originally had millions of people who were ethnically Illyrian, and the Albanians are the only Illyrians left. And I am purposely restraining myself from a nerd rant about the Illyrians because they had several brilliant religious breakthroughs. They were militarily some of the best soldiers on earth. It was a wealthy society. A lot of the Roman emperors were Illyrians, and the modern Albanians are the only Illyrians left. And the Albanians survived as Illyrians, much like the Romanians as Latins, because they were a poor mountain people. Where the Albanians, they live in what was often the poorest country in Europe. It's across from Italy, and they were these mountain clan peoples that had never really attained political consciousness. And they have a lot of traits comparably to the Irish, such as honor culture or clans, or they're some of the toughest fighters in that area. And they were largely sort of off the map or unconquered until the Ottoman Turks. And the Ottoman Turks made a deal with the Albanians. They could use the Albanians to to subdue the local other peoples. So the Albanians were on board with that. But even during the Roman Empire, the Romans would avoid Albania. It was sort of like a pirate coastline that was part of the Roman Empire. They just didn't want to police it. And so the Albanians are the former Illyrians. The other population that survived in the Balkans after this Bulgar period were the Romanians. And the Romanians are culturally and linguistically Italians. They're like a third Italian genetically. The Romanians are called Vlachis, where Romania fits into three different subcomponents. You have Transylvania, you have Wallachia, and Moldova. And the ethnic Romanians are the majority in Wallachia and Moldova, which should be the same country, but Moldova was part of the Soviet Union, which is why it's independent. It was part of Romania earlier. And inside Transylvania, you have a variety of other populations who had not yet arrived at that point. But we have to get to Eastern Europe's diversity as it forms historically. It's really remarkable that the Vlachis have survived that long because they live in the alluvial bottomlands of the mouth of the Danube River. And I've always been curious why the Vlachis survived, because this area has been consistently conquered by nomadic peoples. For most of the last 2,000 years, Wallachia was under nomadic governance. And the nomads killed most of the rest of the people. The farmer population of Ukraine had been killed multiple times. But for some reason, the Wallachians survived as this Latinate descended people in Romania. And I think it's just because they were far enough west that the nomads didn't kill them. And they made useful farmers for the nomads. Because the nomads did periodically enslave people around the bottom of Ukraine and then make them grow grain for export.
Which is the similar pattern that you mentioned earlier about using slaves to watch the farm, and then you go around riding on horseback fighting people. Which is kind of Spartan and Helot.
It is. I was thinking of that as well as I said it. It's a very similar dynamic to the Spartan nobility and the Helots. Slavery was such an omnipresent variable in this time period. You could potentially argue that the East European slave trade was more important to history than the African one. Millions of people were involved, and the Slavs were the term Slav is the same word as slave for a reason. Right. And the Slavs were sold into slaves into Western Europe for a brief period. They were sold into slaves in the Muslim world the most so. The Slavs were used as a litany of different roles, especially so concubines. The favorite slave concubines for the Muslim rulers were from Circassia, which is the Caucasus. And they have their own culture we can get to that goes back thousands of years. But the Vikings...
I think that's still the case for male brides. I mean, like male brides, like postage.
Cool. And the Slavs were sold by the Vikings, who we'll get to. But the slave trade was a huge variable here, and we'll see it as late as the end of this time period, where the Crimean Tatars sold millions of Russians into slavery during the early modern period. And no, I'm just thinking of the human. I can say stuff like that, but I just there's a staggering human toll to stuff like this that it's easy to write off, and you can sort of just talk about it, but you can't really. It doesn't really register until you take a moment. Jump back to the Bulgar Confederacy, they were a Turkic people from beyond the Urals, and they migrated first across the Pontic grassland, which is the area of South Ukraine that has the steppe climate, where all of the nomadic peoples that entered Europe came through the Pontic grassland. But then the Bulgars turned south into the former Byzantine Empire, and because the Byzantine Balkans had been so depopulated, the military system the Byzantines used, and McNeill articulates this brilliantly, was dependent on them having a professional army of knight cavalry, because the Byzantines got the knights from Persia, who used them to fight the nomads in Turkestan. And the Byzantines were not willing to create a landed nobility until later in the empire, because this strategy hadn't worked, where they would hire these men, keep them in the cities, and then ride out to attack the invading barbarians. The problem was that the Byzantine Balkans had been so depopulated, there weren't enough cities that the Byzantines could actually hold the region except along the coastline. So the Slavs migrated in, populate the entire interior of the Balkans just through moving their people in, and the Byzantines could hold the coast. And so it was really weird. Even in the bottom of Greece, the Byzantines held like 3 or 4 coastal cities. In the interior were the Slavic barbarians. And same thing along the coast of Albania or Illyria. Even within 30 miles of Constantinople was Bulgarian territory. And the Bulgars today are a Slavic people who speak a Slavic language, and they're genetically Slavic. But the original Bulgars were Turks. And what happened over time is that they intermarried with the Slavs, much like the later Vikings. And the Bulgar Confederacy was a surprisingly powerful and developed country at a certain point. The Bulgars, because they were fighting the Byzantines for centuries, they built out their own parallel structure. They had towns, they had a government system, and the Bulgars and the Byzantines fought for many centuries, and they became the greatest thorn in the Byzantine side, sometimes even more so than the Arab Caliphate, which was much larger, where they besieged Constantinople, nearly taking it, and at the mid to late 9th century, the Bulgars converted to Orthodox Christianity, which was a huge move because they had been pagan barbarians, but they too had to take in the Christian structure to manage a more complex society, like everyone else who had to convert to Christianity in this region. And with that, they became culturally dependent on Byzantium. And then the Slavic alphabet, which we see in Russia, it's a derivation of Byzantine monks going to the Bulgars, figuring out how the Slavic languages worked, then turning the Greek script into the Slavic language. And this was the alphabet that eventually spread up from the Bulgars to Russia to become their current alphabet. And this was done by a Byzantine monk named Cyril, which is like the Cyrillic alphabet. And this was part of a two-sided process where the Franks in the west and the Byzantines in the south were both courting the new Slav civilization, where the Bulgars would listen to them. Because the Catholics and the Orthodox had already de facto split up as different civilizations. Although they were technically still the same religion, they would compete against one another, they'd act out of their own interests, where the Bulgars considered converting to Catholicism, while the Byzantines had missionaries and agents up by Bohemia and Poland. And so there was a point where this entire region was being divided up between the Catholics and the Byzantines.
It kind of makes sense that the Roman Empire split along the averages of the differentiating cultures.
Yeah.
Around the Mediterranean and the West. Makes sense. And then the Turkic, you had the Turkic Slav mix, and then they became Christian.
Yes.
And they became Orthodox Christian. And do Russians have any speech patterns that are similar to Greek or like an accent? Because I know Portuguese people, like if you hear Portuguese, it sounds a little bit like Russian. I wonder if there's any connection lingually through Greece.
I don't know. I would assume so, especially for high class philosophic or religious terminology. Because when the Russians, and we're not going to get there yet, but when the Russians converted to Orthodoxy in the ninth century, the Greeks had a throttle on their church system until the Mongol period, where even in the early 13th century, something like 80% of monks, of important church leaders in Russia, were people from Greece. So because the Greeks controlled their church, they filled out the Russian church
Really?
structure through the Middle Ages with people who were ethnic Greeks from Greece. And the church,
So they act as their Italy, their Vatican, like
yeah,
Greece, Italy. Yeah. And
and
it's hard to even think of the Byzantines as Greek. I don't even, it's like I stopped thinking about the Greeks 2000 years ago, but was really the majority of the Byzantine Empire kind of like Greek and Greek controlled?
oh, it was all Greek controlled.
Right. And I know that. It's hard for me to like, I call them Byzantines, not Greeks. We should call them Greeks.
They were
Give them a
called
little credit.
Greeks at the time. The Vikings called them Greeks. And
Right. Because, yeah.
I think the Franks might have called them Greeks to invalidate them being Romans. They said that
And it is significant that Greece was that significant that much later. That's not that long ago in the
yeah.
history of
And
people.
if the Byzantines survived, I think they'd be a state of importance equivalent to Germany, something like that. They'd have Anatolia and the Balkans, or over 100 million
Right.
people. They'd almost certainly be industrialized. Um, and so the Bulgars were eventually defeated in the early 11th century as part of the Byzantine Renaissance, which involved several good emperors, where the Byzantines had been on the defensive for a while, and then they sort of pulled things back together after their lengthy religious civil war. And under Basil Bulgar Slayer, the Byzantines conquered the entire Balkans up to the Danube. And he was called Bulgar Slayer because in his great battle against the Bulgars, he clawed out their entire defeated army's prisoners' eyes, except for one man who he left with one eye to walk them back to their capital, because he said it will be worse if they have an entire blind army they have to take care of than to just kill them.
Yeah, I would never feel happier to have one eye than if I was that guy.
Yeah.
Like it'd be the only time you lost an eye and we're like really happy.
Whoa, man.
The odds of that are so low that you're the guy with the one eye left.
What about Odin sacrificing an eye to see Yggdrasil?
Yeah, well, he just did that for the medal. These guys were forced in. It's not as much fun if you're forced into the situation. You have to do that of your own volition to make it fun.
um, but
Don't do that though. Keep your eyes.
I like having two eyes. It's fun. Um, so Byzantines took over the Balkans, and then the Balkans became a center of one of the greatest heresies, or the Bogomils, where the Bogomils were these Gnostic Cathars who became one of the dominant sects of the Balkans to fight against the Byzantine authorities. And this was a widespread heresy, and so a lot of the Cathars in the south of France were called the Bogomils, because these former Bulgar areas didn't want to submit to the Greek Church. And the Bogomils weren't actually Christians, although they pretended to be. Also, I believe Bosnia, or no, it was Montenegro. Montenegro, the Catholic Church took them in and then openly said they were heretics. But it was okay that they were heretics and did not follow Catholic doctrine at all because they were so irrelevant and they pledged complete submission to the Pope. The Pope was like,
I was going to say, because there's like three of them and they live in
yeah,
the mountains.
the
There's
Pope
still
was,
not that many. My
yeah,
friend moved there and took over the government.
really?
Some political operator from Arizona. Yeah, he just helped their freedom movement organize and they won. It
I
was
was
like really easy.
I was part of Praxis, which was an organization to build a city-state in the Balkans. They have one of the most crazy corporate histories I've seen of anywhere. I will not share it out of just I don't want to get involved in this right now. Um, but it was what it was. And so Montenegro's strange. Wait, no. How did you do? Is there more to that story?
I mean, that's basically the summary. But
Huh.
he has a house there now, and it's really nice place. Like really cheap. You can build a whole new awesome house. It's all in the mountains. 'Cause it's such a small population because it's literally the top of a mountain range, like
So
with tons of trees.
I I heard about Andrew Tate before he was popular because he was part of
Hmm.
the same sort of digital nomad sort of I was living with a bunch of like frat boy fuck boys during my digital nomad phase. And so he was part of those
Hmm.
circles. So he would be like, I heard of this guy named Andrew Tate who went to Romania as this wealthy guy and just took it over and he just does whatever he wants there. And that was the narrative about him before he got popular. And so to see the disjoint between Andrew Tate being like this idolized expat bro to being the public figure was such a stark thing.
That's funny. This is a very different type of guy. He's more like a longtime Ron Paul Republican libertarian operative, and
Yeah.
it's not that big of a country, but it's a really nice place. So, I mean, they have some potential as well. Like they're one of the areas in Eastern Europe that is, and they're in a nice moment in their country because things are just getting better.
Romania?
No, no, Montenegro.
Oh,
And
okay.
I don't think Andrew Tate controls Romania because I'm
He
pretty
doesn't.
sure. Did they protect him or they arrested him?
We're
Yeah.
not going to talk about Andrew Tate. This is my beef. I friggin' have to deal with this presentist garbage all day. Whenever I open my fucking phone, it's some like shit about claviction.
You brought him up.
Okay,
Yeah.
fair, fair. Um, uh, so the thing about standards is you will break them. Um, but Montenegro, it's crazy that they were an independent mountain from centuries. The Ottomans did not conquer them for centuries. Well, they had the entire rest of the Balkans. So if you look at a map of 16th century Europe, it's just little Montenegro surrounded by the huge Ottoman Turks. Because again, much like the Catholic Church, they were so irrelevant. People were like, you can have your thing. And
And no one goes up there anyways. We're not going to bother walking. It's not on a road. It's just like they don't even know they exist.
it's a black mountain, which is the name
Yeah.
in Latin. Um, and Bulgars fell, Byzantines took the Balkans, made it provinces. And this is actually important for the Balkans' later history, where if the Huns had not genocided the region in the 5th century, the Balkans could have potentially been an England or a France or a Spain because they had a comparable level of development, Roman history, and the Balkans does have hard geography, but so does Scotland or Norway, which are staggeringly wealthy countries, or Switzerland. Um,
Mm.
and
Hong
so,
Kong.
yeah, it's weird that I'm saying the Albanians are one of the most primitive people in Europe, but it's weird that I'm saying the relatives of the Albanians could have had this great sort of civilization. But I mean, imagine if the only Britons that were left were the Highland Scots. If you look at the Highland Scots in their tartan up in the mountains, you think this people, if
Mm.
they kept the rest of this island, could have conquered the world. Things are weird. Life is queer.
That's crazy. That's a great
Yeah,
analogy for it. And
yeah,
Montenegro is kind of like if Robin Hood won. Like
exactly.
they just made their own village in the
There,
forest.
the Balkans has a lot of Robin Hood myths. That's actually an archetype in their mythology. You see it in Albania, in
Interesting.
a lot of the neighboring countries. I think Greece. Modern, oh God, I can't get into that now. I was thinking about how Greek culture had altered over the Byzantine through the Turkic period, but that I cannot contain that within the plot line now. Um, and Byzantine Balkans, this matters because you saw this wide scale dispersion of Slavs south of the Danube, and it was yet to be understood what ethnic identity these people would develop. because they could have been a single pan-Slavic ethnicity like the Bulgars, because they'd all been Bulgarian territory. And that would have made it more like Poland or Russia, a single unified Slavic country. And one of the trends you're going to keep seeing over the course of this video is these ethnic formations are more arbitrary here than they are in a lot of the world, although there are cases where that's very much not fair. It's Eastern Europe is a place of empires. It's not a place of nation states. And I'm reading a really brilliant book called Visions of Empire by an author whose last name is Kumar. And it's about the ruling ideologies of 5 great empires. And I was really lucky to be reading it today because it taught me all of these lessons about Eastern Europe that are very applicable for this video and next video. But one of which is that in nation states, you try to build the separate unity of that people, like the English or the French or the Spanish, who form from a series of distinct ethnicities. What you have in empires is the creation of an elite culture that can span the different conquered people of an empire. Because a nation is a single people under a government. An empire is one people who subdue many others. So imperial cultures require a sort of upper class that has the ethnic identity of the dominant population, but the upper classes of other conquered peoples can imitate it and become part of that ruling culture. But often imperial cultures end up backstabbing the majority original population that built them. And so that's what you see in Eastern Europe, where in Western Europe, you saw these unified nation states, but in Eastern Europe, in Russia, their elites did that, backstabbing their own population. Poland did it too, with their greater empire. The Ottoman Turks did it, and the Hungarians did it as well, where you have these broader elite cultures, and Eastern Europe's potential was destroyed firstly by concentrating on just an elite level, but the elite culture was quite refined, but then killing the elites is what really destroyed Eastern Europe, where
Interesting.
Eastern Europe is all peasant societies today because they killed the upper classes. And
Sure.
I was talking to my dad about what were the populations with the highest degrees of interiority today, and interiority is basically the introspective ability to enter your mind and then build a worldview from your mind that you can bring out onto the world. And we agreed.
Thinking independent of data or
Yes.
whatever.
And we came to the conclusion the 2 interior populations left are Northwest Europeans and their diaspora, and the Japanese and the Jews. And so we were talking about how the Middle East and Eastern Europe used to have high degrees of interiority, in Islam too. Islam's Middle East. We were talking about how Middle East in Eastern Europe used to have high degrees of interiority, but that was concentrated among the upper classes. So when you wipe out their elite populations, you destroy all levels of interiority. And so in Eastern Europe, with these countries like Poland or Russia or the Teutonic Knights or the Ottomans, they don't develop clean nations. There's the upper class imperial culture, and then the peasants who operate on a lower level inside their communities. And the national identity of the peasants is very much up for grabs. So it wasn't until the mid to late 20th century, actually entire 20th century, that Eastern Europe had to think about what its nationalities were. In the 19th century,
Right. And if you
in the 19th century, the nationality sort of just screamed out of these bigger empires, we want to be free. But then when they got freedom, they had to sort of divide up, this is for this is for that. And so in the Balkans, you have a variety of populations. I would guess a little bit more than a majority of the population of the Balkans is Slavic. And among these Slavs, it's very much unclear what the boundaries are between a Bulgarian or a Bosnian or a Serb or a Fyramite. I like the term Fyrom purely for ironic reasons, but we can get to that. And the Byzantines built the Orthodox churches of the Balkans in a manner to naturally subdivide these populations, so that when these populations were governed by larger empires like the Byzantines or the Turks, the imperial cultures of their upper classes would reflect the ruling families, and then their populations, which had identities built upon the local church would have these smaller subdivided local identities which would not be able to cooperate against the larger governance. So the Byzantines established the Orthodox churches of the Balkans um, by the sort of each of these independent countries. And this is one of my dad's rants that I got from him. He's been studied the Balkans for a while, and he's told me this like 5 times. Is the establishment of these independent churches by the Byzantines in the medieval period metastasized into creating these distinct national identities whenever the higher government was removed. And so it's an example of social engineering working very well.
Interesting, because they basically set up a church in all the different areas, and then that forms some kind of basis for communication between them while also enabling or creating some sort of self-expression. So it wasn't exactly the same, but there was still a layer. And does lack of elites correlate with empire? Because if you don't have enough elites, then you need like a bigger territory with, if you have 3 people, I'm not going to do
Yeah,
a math example, but
yeah,
you know what I mean.
you are completely correct. And that is a point so few people know, but matters so greatly. I like to say the most important thing for an army is a good officer corps. And you could write a significant amount of the history of the world through the lens of mid-level leadership. A society's mid-level leadership will determine literally every single thing in its social structure.
Wow, that's fascinating you say that because, like I've said before, when I went to work in Asia, one of the reasons I went to work there is they have a huge shortage of middle managers.
Yeah,
So it's a great way to get middle management experience, like right out of the gate early in your career, because people don't do anything unless their boss tells them to. And that's like largely culturally ingrained because I know they can think of more things than they do because they
yeah,
know what they could do, but they don't. So like it's not like a fatalistic thing, but that is like a very clear condition, cultural
yeah.
condition.
I often think about how hard it must be for a lot of East Asians that there are populations with very high degrees of interiority and sentience, and they live in these brutally restrictive societies where
Well, that's why Japanese fantasy is so crazy because
it is.
they can think of it. They do have the ideas. They just
Yeah,
can't do a
because
lot of stuff.
the East Asians, Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, they'll do school for like 16 hours a day for a lot of their high school
Mm.
as just the
Oh
baseline,
yeah.
12 to 16 hours. Then they get stuck in these brutalizing work conditions. And then there are these societies obsessed with family, and then they spend no time with their family. Um,
They have to be in school all day because their parents are at work all day.
yes, it's a. I could speak to this. I choose not to. Um, so, Bogomils. Um,
Back to Eastern Europe.
yeah, I had to pick the keyword to reorient my mind. Um, the friggin' what's the for video games the hotkey you play to like
Oh yeah, control whatever.
yeah the control X
Hotkeys, yeah.
the control X in StarCraft to build more resource centers. Um, Eastern Europe. So we have the Byzantine Balkans. Um, it remains part of the empire until the until 1204 with the West European takeover of Constantinople, and then it fractures. But let's get back further north and then return to the Balkans because we're entering like 600-year time gaps. Um, Further north in Poland, in Czechia, in these places, the Slavic tribes could evolve more in sort of organic independence from the larger societies. And when they later did, it was from the Franks and the West Europeans, where the largest force, the two largest sort of non-civilized forces that were acting upon the Slavs, besides the ones I've already articulated, are the Khazars and the Vikings. The Khazars were another Turkic people, much like the Avars or the Bulgars, and they were also from Asia, and their base was around the Caucasus in the old Aryan homeland between Ukraine and Kazakhstan, and their capital was around Stalingrad. And they converted to Judaism because they were trade partners of both the Byzantines and the Arabs. And if they had converted to either country's religion, it would have turned them into vassals of them. And instead, they picked Judaism because, like everywhere else in Eastern Europe, the monotheistic religions had the social technologies to move past a population of like 1 million people. Beneath a
Mm.
government of like 1 million people, you can have the old pagan religions. Beyond that threshold, you need to have the Abrahamic religions to be the social scaffolding. And so they picked Judaism because it had all of the prescriptions of an Abrahamic religion without being related to the others. This was a strategy that peoples in Central Asia solved by converting to Manichaeism or Gnosticism or or Buddhism or other non-Christianity Islam religions. And the Khazars have for a long time been the origin of a lot of conspiracy theories. But this was largely a historic glitch. Modern Ashkenazi Jews in Eastern Europe have no genetic impact from the Khazars. They're half Levantine, half French and Italian, and they migrated in from the West
Okay.
in the High Middle Ages. The Khazars converted to Judaism. It's unclear how serious the population was about this. It might have just been a LARP among the elites. And then the
Did they stay Jewish? Like,
so they were destroyed by the Vikings, where the Khazars had their own
oh, okay.
society. They could go toe to toe with the Byzantines and the Arabs in a few wars. They had a city called Itil that was surprisingly big for the steppe. They had a bureaucratic military system, wealthy trade. The Khazars were a genuine, nearly civilized outgrowth on the steppe in a way you did not see before or after. So I want to give these medieval kingdoms justice where others would ignore them. And the Khazars were wiped out by the Vikings who came down from the north. And the Vikings, or as they were called, the Rus, they started in Sweden and they were trying to trade with the Byzantines in the Middle East, where there were huge markets at Constantinople or during the Islamic Golden Age where the Vikings would bring slaves and amber and furs, where Eastern Europe's relationship with the Middle East at this point was comparable from Africa to Europe today. All developing economies start with raw material production
Hmm.
and then move up value added through manufacturing and then up to intellectual or philosophic, and then you degenerate back into poverty. And so Eastern Europe started
Fun.
getting large influxes of capital from the Middle East due to this, where we've found these huge silver hoards in Scandinavia of Arabic gold. We found Buddha images, we found Buddha icons from India, Scandinavia, Chinese things. And Eastern Europe was part of this trade system held together by the Rus. And the Rus are the origins of modern Russia, but there's a complication there between Rus and Russia, which we'll talk about soon. And the historic legend for how the Rus started was that the Slavic peoples were in disorder and they invited the manly Rurik over from Sweden to be their king because they knew they needed a king, and Rurik was manly enough to do so. This was likely not what happened. Rather, the Vikings showed up to go on the river system. No, it's pretty good.
Yeah. And then they said, I need a strong man. Oh, and you're so strong. You look so strong. Can you come out? I said, yeah, sure.
Exactly.
I'll do what I need.
Um, and yeah, the Middle Ages is funny sometimes. And so the Vikings established these forts along their trade network through like the Dnieper and the Nestor and these rivers where there is a consistent trade pattern from the Baltic down to the Black Sea and the Caspian through Russia's river systems that unifies the core of the European Russian nation. And the Vikings started with this. Um, and the Vikings reached out as far as Central Asia, the Caspian Sea, North Africa. They really got far, and they likely went even further than we know because this is not a very well recorded era of history. Um, and the Vikings established a series of forts, and then the Slavs sort of entered their orbit because the Vikings were the first people who established a frame for the region. And the Vikings weren't too oppressive. At their worst, they would just sort of herd the Slavs together and enslave them. Eastern Europe had this weird
Mhm.
dynamic of treating populations like cattle, which because both the Vikings and the steppe nomads and the Slavs to a lesser extent were
Murders.
cattle herding peoples. So the Vikings might just periodically see a population, say you've got good slaves and take you, or otherwise just build a fort and then have them grow food for them. It was a chaotic time to,
Just like Mongols in China,
yeah,
just like the Mongol-China relationship.
yes, very, very like that. And there's a lot of dynamics you would have seen in the African slave trade of tribes trying to get people from each other or brutal warlords who built their power off the slave trade. I've heard that the Vikings would have these Slav sub-commanders in the Rus, where the guy in modern Belarus was supposedly just this barbaric commander who would just keep his people in punitive conditions on the threat of sending them out to slavery. You just periodically butcher people. And there was stuff like that, but the Vikings, they were pretty good, where Kievan Rus was one of the wealthiest places in Europe. It was one of the freest societies in Europe. And these cities, such as Novgorod in the north, Kiev in the south, even in the 11th century, they were seen as good places. They were wealthy, they were well built, they had rule of law. And Russia, until the period of the Mongol governance, it's really stark to compare it to later eras where the Kumar author I'm reading, he was saying that when you look at the Mongol, the Russia that the Mongols faced, this is a society in decadence, where the Rus had built a society where Novgorod had a parliament. There were parliaments across Russia. They had property rights. Russia did not practice serfdom. They had some of the highest meat consumption rates of anywhere in Europe. And people who were wandering through would comment on how vigorous and happy Russia was. And so in the 12th century, you would think that Russia would become a society like England or France or Western Europe. It had all the same traits. The
Hmm.
Orthodox Church had been spreading civilization where that was a really strong undercurrent. And the Rus monarchy fell apart in the early 11th century, subdivided into these different principalities. And we're not going to get to the Mongols yet, but when the Mongols attacked Russia, they could defeat these subdivided Russian states because Russia was a society that had worked.
They could defeat them because it worked. I thought because they didn't get ally with each other, like we talked about in the other episode. How does that relate?
Decadence is an outcome of a society that has succeeded.
Oh, because they worked too well. Decadence.
Yeah.
Okay, I get it.
Um,
Yeah.
and, and maybe I'm glazing the Kievan Rus too hard. Maybe I haven't heard that like the one or two bad variables that sinks my estimation of them. But from the things I've pieced together, Kievan Rus seems to have been a healthy society. And so,
I mean, the more impressive thing would be that if they did unite, the idea that they would have beaten the Mongols because nobody beat the Mongols. So if they could have beaten them united, then that's a sign in of itself of how impressive it is. And the Danube is super interesting in all of this because it's super underrated because it's a river, doesn't stick out on a map. You don't think of it like the Mediterranean, but it's just as important as the Straits of Gibraltar. It's a direct connection into that trade network. My only question is, how do they get back up, or which way does the river run? I mean, all rivers run north, so except for the Nile. I mean, they would have had to walk one way, right? I mean, how'd that work?
so Danube flows from the Alps east until the Black Sea. and it's one of the most ethnically diverse rivers along the world. Today, the Danube flows through Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, uh, Slovakia, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, and maybe one other. In each, most of those are distinct ethnic groups with their own history. So if you go along the Danube, you'll find so many nations, and it doesn't even include the former diversity. Where I saw this crazy map of the 19th century Balkans, where it was just like someone vomited on the map, where you had Albanian populations by Athens and Greece. You had Romanian populations up by like Attica, central Greece. You had uh, Turkic, Crimean Tatar populations that were huge at the mouth of the Danube that have since been kicked out. You had huge Turkish populations,
Mm,
huge Jewish populations, German populations, where the 20th century in Eastern Europe was a tragedy for multiple reasons, but it was in large part a tragedy of the genocide and ethnic replacement of a very diverse Eastern Europe, with the Balkans being the most so. And so with the river traffic, it's
it
far.
goes south, right? Yeah.
No, it goes east.
Right, right, right.
Danube goes east.
But down, they go down from Scandinavia,
So you are thinking of the
east
Dnieper
down.
and the
Yeah.
Dniester. The Danube is different.
Okay, okay.
So the Danube's Vienna to the Black Sea. The Dnieper and the Dniester, and there's a third one, the Dnieper, Dniester, Neva. Um, they flow from St. Petersburg down to Crimea.
Got it. Right. And the Scandinavians connect from the ocean
Yeah.
into that. Yeah.
Um, and so when you're going upriver, it's significantly harder than going downriver. You have to row and stop your boat at night rather than just flowing the current. So as an example, I think it would take 10 times as long to go up the Mississippi as down the Mississippi in early 19th century America. Um,
Wow.
and
Yeah, that makes about sense.
yes, it does. It was you had to get pretty strong to go up the Mississippi, but water traffic was always vastly cheaper in the pre-industrial world than land traffic, so you would still go up the river like that, even if it was so much harder.
Right. And then we have workarounds around the rapids where you have to carry your boat or something like Coeur d'Ivoire.
I will humor this
I mean,
tangent.
it would have been a challenge, but yeah.
I will
Maybe they brought heavier goods on the way down and lighter on the way up.
I will humor this tangent, but I was just thinking about if we had YouTube shorts in different historic time periods. I was imagining a French courrier de bois uh, just saying, me and the Mandan people of Iowa, we're eating buffalo together. And I just brought my canoe. This is Pierre Lefebvre, and I'm out by Montana in this. You'd have to use Starlink, but I'm just thinking of how. Uh,
Oh yeah.
of
The,
all
the historical, like if someone from 300 years ago did the Insta reel, those are hilarious.
you know, of any given era of history, we are the one that has the most boring internet. If you dropped the internet in the Napoleonic Wars, you would have Goethe and Hegel and Rousseau and Napoleon all as influencers. Now I have to friggin' watch like I Show Speed and Keemstar.
Well, that's why we watch those videos of Russians playing with bears and stuff, because that's another example of metal internet. Like back in the day, the animal videos that there would be
I share
in,
so
2000 years ago. I mean,
I share so many animal videos and people find it annoying.
you're supposed to say timeline cleanser and then they understand.
Why do I give a fuck?
Unless the videos you're sharing are like, well, when I first went to Thailand and I got on the internet, I went to YouTube in Thailand, it was all like lion fights tiger and like real fights between lions and tigers and different animals, just like in
Yeah.
these arena
My
zoos or not zoos. I don't know.
My mom made me take an etiquette course as a child. It was something in my town. A lot other people in my school did it. You'd get taught table manners and how like European style dancing. And I remember seeing that and thinking this will not be applicable to my life. And so when people explain internet etiquette to me, I'm like, oh, this is an equivalently silly level of etiquette. I think
Oh, yeah,
I
because
think
it's not going to be relevant.
I think politeness very does matters tremendously. I think politeness is very important. But I
Hmm.
look at the internet etiquette and I'm like, this is equivalently silly to like having a fish fork. Because they'd say this is your fish fork, this is your soup spoon versus your main course soup spoon. I'm like, I will never use this.
Oh yeah, I probably don't even. I'm not even familiar with internet etiquette. I don't even know how to do what do you call them? Acronyms or not acronyms? The shorter words. I don't know what almost any of them mean.
Yeah, when I was in
I don't even
college,
know what it's called.
I would ask girls for their phone number, and people you apparently you're supposed to ask them for their Snap. And I was like, why does it matter if it's Snapchat or the phone? I still have a contact to.
Oh, that's interesting. Little cultural things. I bet those are going to be really temporary and they're based on the technology. Because
Yeah,
Snapchat is less committal. It's less linked to your profile. Yeah,
I
you
grew
go to Snapchat to Instagram after. That's the upgrade.
I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, like Pennsylvania, and I went to college in Maine, which was a huge cultural jump no one told me about. New Englanders have completely different social rules, and there were a lot of weird interactions due to that. Um, but we could have a
Eastern
cultural
Europe.
we could have a cultural America video in the future. But DACA. Um, the Rus have worked. You had the Byzantine Balkans. You have around 1000 AD, the region converted to monotheistic religions en masse, where the Poles and the Czechs converted to Catholicism, while the Balkans converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, as did the Russians, which is still the great civilizational fault line in Eastern Europe between the the Western civilization and the Orthodox civilization. Because, as I said before, the identity of these peasants, and in most cases the entire nation, was religious, because the religion spanned these diverse ethnic groups. Eastern Europe had to rely on religion for its national identity more than Western Europe, because they were often fighting people of different religions with ethnically diverse empires. And so, if you were to ask a Russian during the period of the Russian Civil War, during the period of the Tsarist Empire, um, what their identity was, they would say, "I'm Orthodox first," and that's how the Russians bridged the ethnic gaps inside their empire. Because like 20% of the modern Russian genome's of Finnish origin, a lot's Turkic, Siberian, uh, Muslim, and as these societies developed, they were dependent on these larger civilizations where the Slavs were never able to make a distinct identity as a civilization distinct from the larger ones. And so the Slavs were always divided between what civilization they were a part of, and later the Muslims converted other Slavs. And so there's this undercurrent of ethnically similar populations divided up by empire, divided up by religion. So you could have an area like the South Slavs around Yugoslavia, where Croats, Slovenians, Bosnians, Serbs, Pyramites could technically be the same ethnicity. However, that technicality is very thin, where de facto they have split into those different peoples, where even people who, the Croats were more different from the Serbs, although that was caused by the Croats converting to Catholicism and the Serbs converting to Orthodox. But that religious division had happened enough earlier on that they were clearly distinct ethnicities, even though the social planners around World War One thought they'd be close enough. So the Croats genocided the Serbs,
Mm.
and then the Serbs genocided the Croats back. Meanwhile, the Bosnians had converted to Islam during the Ottoman period, and then the Christians gobbled onto an identity that the Bosnians had that made Bosnian independent from the religious identity, but the Serbs said the Bosnians were part of them. Well, If you look at Fyrom, which I will keep saying ironically, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia was a name that was invented because the Greeks were angry that the Fyrom people were claiming to be Macedonia, because that would suggest that they were relatives of Alexander the Great, while the Macedonians are Slavs. And so the Greeks were so angry that the Macedonians were claiming relation to Alexander the Great that they demanded they change their name. The Macedonians built this huge statue of Alexander, probably the most impressive thing in their country, and they build all of their society and their propaganda around him. And the Bulgars claim that the Fyrom people are, okay, they're Macedonians, I'm sorry. The Macedonians, the Bulgars claim that they're Bulgars. They are, in fact, ethnically closest to the Bulgars. The Serbs claimed that they were Serbian. And then the Greeks claimed that this area is theirs. And then the Albanians fought over it too. So, tiny country, probably the size of like Delaware, has been claimed by so many different nations.
Is there like a mix of all of them on the 23andMe test, just getting pulled apart in every direction?
I am surprised I know this, but 23andMe subdivides Balkan ancestry by larger genetic pools rather than by the subregion. So you have a singular Balkan ancestry in the 23andMe data set, and then they subdivide their data sets based on regions that are not large enough to be small enough to be contentious. So they'd say South Balkans, they'd say Greater Romania, they'd say Bulgaria, etc. So they've gotten around.
So they try and make it less contentious.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that the recent DNA testing has brought some answers to a lot of these long-term debates, right? And is that shaking out in the culture of those societies? Or are they kind of ignoring that?
The developer of spiral dynamics, which is the theory of consciousness development, he did like sort of piecework in the Balkans, and he said the region was was the singular place in the world where he found no one above level 4 of consciousness. Level 4 is the ability to perceive the world through your tribe's lens.
Right.
Literally no one involved was capable
But they're all at level 4.
Yeah.
There's no one above it, but they're all there.
Yes, they're all at level 4.
They've got it down. They've mastered level 4.
Yes. And the churches are part of this as well. And the churches encourage them in this nationalism.
It doesn't matter if you actually find differences or similarities, because people will fight who they want to. And it's funny how this like tribal, even genocidal logic can get all the way down to like the McCormicks versus the O'Reillys family feud or whatever. Where they're actually trying to, you can say from the outside, hey, they're similar. But in their minds, they've identified themselves as separate, literally genetic families that they're trying to exterminate.
That's how I always perceived the Israel-Gaza conflict, and I can't believe others don't perceive it this way. Where when I saw Israel-Gaza, I thought, oh, this is a clan dispute. This is North and South Ireland. I can look at North and South Ireland and think, these are people who are genetically and culturally nearly identical, but they got stuck in this honor dispute over the lands that they have to continue for generations until it's over.
Because there is some genetic bleed into Israel. It's not like a totally clear.
And so when you look at the Israel-Gaza conflict or a lot of the Balkan things, like this is a clan honor dispute. I mean, both sides spurred the other's honor. They have these series of insults on one another's honor code, so they're going to fight over this. I am not part of this honor dispute. I am unclear why.
Imagine trying to jump in and go like, well, they settled here first, or they were after, or you shot me first. It's like, bro, it's an honor dispute. They don't even remember. That's not the point.
Are you fucking nuts? Are we going to go to the Hatfields and the McCoys and say, hey, no, imagine trying to arbitrate the Hatfields and the McCoys.
Yeah. Or just like if the Hatfields and McCoys were YouTubing and then the comment section was like one side aligned completely with the one and one with the other. It's like, hey, why are you guys jumping on this feud? And it connects to the broader Arab world, right? Because Palestine is a way for the Arabs to have influence towards their outcome or whatever. And at this point, like the broader Arab world is more over this honor fight than a lot of the U.S. is. Like,
It's freaking
which
nuts.
is hilarious.
I know exactly what you're saying. I mean, if you go to Qatar, they don't care. I haven't been to Qatar, I would assume. If you go to Kuwait, The upper classes have moved past it, and the populations are still obsessed with it.
Peace
You,
in the Middle East is not conditional on whatever resolution you
yeah.
think needs to
Uh,
happen. Yeah.
and I can't imagine you would look at like an honor dispute like that and think, yeah, this is something we can resolve easily. These centuries of just utter hatreds and blood spilt and that stuff. Um, and it's just very naive and silly. But I might cut this
There's
out.
only one way to solve this:
I
Trump
might
casinos.
I might cut the story out, but my dad's obsessed with the Balkans, and he's been there to go to the different countries, and he was in Kosovo, where he saw this. He was in this monastery, and there was this monk who was arguing why he was not guilty for collusion in a genocide to UN peacekeepers. And he was just arguing, saying, I was not here at that specific moment where I specifically said to do this. And my dad said, this guy's like
Right.
guilty. My dad walked past and like, this dude's definitely guilty.
He's like Fuentes at Jan 6. Well, all I did was yell on the megaphone to go in the building. I wasn't there.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? Are you crazy?
And a great example of these East European disputes is the division in Rus and Rossiya, where Rus was the ethnic group of the Kievan Rus that modern Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are contained within. And this was a distinct ethnic group, like how the Romans evolved as the Italians, Spanish, and the sorry, just the noise is killing me. Italians, French, Spanish, but between the Rus and the Russians and the Ukrainians and these peoples had their own distinct ethnogeneses that were informed by being conquered by Poland or the Mongols later. And so Russia, or the country that formed around Moscow as a political unit, they have said that they are the descendants of the Rus. So they can take Ukraine and Belarus as parts of them. And then the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, more so the Ukrainians, the Belarusians don't care as much. They say that Kievan Rus is different from Russia. And my attitude towards this is I don't think there's real justice in this world, and this is as if the American South won the Civil War and they became a distinct independent country. And it would be genuinely arguable if the American South is a distinct ethnic group because they formed independently, they've been governed independently,
Hmm.
different genetics, but also they are American. And I don't think there is an answer to questions like this.
Yeah, I mean, it just is what it is, and you do whatever you want with it. Like, you can describe it pretty clearly. There's these ethnic splits,
Yes.
and they're in this region, and it's easier to pretend that doesn't exist when you have an empire, or maybe you're incentivized to play those differences down. And then in an opposite situation, you might play them up, but they just are what they are,
Yeah,
and they
exactly.
impact what they do.
And as an example, there have been points where Ukraine's worked with the Russians. There were lengthy periods where Ukrainian was a pure peasant identity, and anyone above a certain social class was Russian. Then there were other periods where Ukraine was independent or persecuted by the Russians, or it had its own very vibrant other culture. So it's not an easy question. It is what it is. And I support Ukrainian independence because I support a free people against getting conquered. Or
Oh, Ukraine is clearly like west east split.
yeah,
Like the voting patterns are exactly, and you're okay. So that's what you're referring to with like the South winning. If the East wins through Russia and takes over the West or something
if
politically,
if the American South had won the U.S. Civil War and they had maintained legal independence for, let's say, at least another 50 years, maybe until the present,
right?
the American South would have evolved in its own convergent direction with its own institutions, government, media. So they would have developed as their own nation over a distinct period. And then, if, let's say, we had reconquered the South, Northern and Southern Americans would look at this and say, are American Southerners their own ethnicity? They've been independent.
Right, right, right.
Period. They've been unified with the rest of the country. They have a distinct genetic pool. Their roots go back to England, not to their roots both go back to England, not to one another. They have their own climate. And so a Northerner could say, you are Americans because of blank historic variables, and a Southerner could say, we are Southerners because of blank variables, and the actual truth would be muddy.
Yeah. That's a really great analogy to help us understand what it's like on the ground in Eastern Europe, because that exact kind of example happens all over in all sorts of crisscrossy ways.
As an example of this with Belarus, Belarus is white Russia. So you had white, black, and red Russia, which are the distinct sub-regions of Ruthenia, or the western part of Ukraine, which their local title is the Rusin. And so the Slovakians will claim to be closer to the Rusin than the Rusin are to the Ukrainians, but it's a continuum where Slovakians are quite ethnically close to both Czechs and Ukrainians. The Czechs have claimed Slovakians as one of theirs because they were part of the Austrian Empire, where all educated people in Slovakia were culturally similar to the Czechs, while the Slovakians, who were almost all peasants, did not have a clear identity. But then the Slovakians will often claim kinship to the Ukrainians. But the only reason the Slovakians and the Czechs are distinct identities is they were stuck on different sides of the mountain during the Hungarian period, medieval period. That is how complicated it is.
Right. And I mean, that might add to the complication is that normally they're not separated by mountains. So I guess, no, that the part of Eastern Europe where it's more split up ethnically are around land barriers, right? Versus the plains.
Yeah. The plains tend to be, so it's complicated. Where the Pripyat marshes of North Ukraine, they act like a distinct geographic feature, like a mountain. So the Slavs started around there, and then the Pripyat marshes block entire militaries. So you can use the Pripyat marshes as a sort of lake or mountain range where everyone has to work around them. That's the line between Ukraine and Belarus, where Belarus, as an example, if it's unclear if Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus are the same ethnicity, Ukraine and Belarus is even less, where Belarus did not desire independence from Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. It just happened to be a distinct SSR due to them being under Polish governance in the early modern period. And so Belarus has remained a puppet of Russia, and they've continually had plans to politically integrate with Russia. The Russians move military forces through them all the time. The dictator is good friends with Putin, although they've had issues and falling out. They're not a total puppet. But then they are the same ethnicity as the Ukrainians, more so than the Russians. So the Belarusians are they are both closer to the Ukrainians and the Russians than the Ukrainians and the Russians are to each other, but they are somehow a distinct ethnicity, and this did not matter because Belarusian was a purely peasant identity. Everyone who was educated was a Russian, and no one cared what the peasants thought. And so in Eastern Europe, the destruction of the elite culture meant all of these peasant identities emerged, which were not formed intellectually. So
right.
Baltic, Finnish, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Romanian, Serbian, Bulgarian, Greek, these were all creations of the 19th century of small, educated intellectual movements who were pulling on these peasant trajectories before, using Western European terminology to articulate peasant cultures. And in most cases, they only got power because an external authority destroyed the larger empire.
Right. So they were intellectualizing as they were going. It was like the car had already started and then they had to like work on the engine as it was moving to.
Yes. As an example, the Finns were conquered by the Scandinavians for their entire history up to a certain point, and then the Russians gave them near functional independence when they were an empire. And so the Finns had this small Scandinavian nobility And over time, they had to artificially create a Finnish identity. And so the Kalevala, which was a big inspiration for The Lord of the Rings, it's the great Finnish epic, that
Hmm.
was them going through their oral storytelling and creating a Lord of the Rings style heroic saga from all of these distinct elements because the Finns were a nomadic herder people. It's really remarkable they're one of the wealthiest countries on earth because they jumped from barbarism to civilization ASAP. I guess cold weather does that to you.
Hmm.
And but the Finns did that the best of any ethnic group in this region because they're more separated from the actual sort of bloodlands of the North European plain. Um, and
It's why the Germans Romaned better than the Italians because they're maybe the cold. They already have the organizing principle. So when you bring organized society, they're pretty good at it.
yes,
It's like how I say conservatives would be better libertarians than libertarians.
it's like,
Libertarians more like Sun Belt people,
whoa, man,
island culture.
it's like that already happened.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's how it always happens. These psychologies get associated with politics, but it's a consistent psychological spectrum.
You ever think how big?
So, what's up?
You ever think how big the world is?
Yes. Yeah.
I
Be
remember,
fun to walk across.
I remember when I hiked the trail and I stopped in a gas station.
You haven't mentioned that in a while.
I hadn't, no. I mean, I did it to brag about it. I mean,
Yeah. Appalachian Trail, gas
yeah.
station.
And I just thought, there's 100 little things in this gas station. This is one building. I could live out of this gas station for months if necessary, and then magnify that across the entire planet.
Oh, why? Just the amount of time you could live off of gas stations. My mind went to zombie apocalypse
So,
movies and how they're like
as
they're eating Cheetos 20 years after civilization fell down, as if there's any nutritional value in that bag.
as an
Like
emotional arc,
learn some medieval crafts.
I remember thinking about you're in a gas station. There's 100 things here.
Hmm.
Medieval peasants would have so much less stuff than this. There is so much prosperity in this singular building we drive past and never think about. You go to the airport, it's 100 flights to anywhere in the world. And you think to yourself,
Yeah.
I could take a flight to Marrakesh, I could take a flight to Calcutta, uh, Brazil, Cleveland, uh, Dubuque, and the world is so big, and now the entire world's dying. And it's like it's so weird to see the incredible amount of potential and wealth and vibrancy of even
Hmm.
2005 and see what we choose to live with now. And I often feel like I'm the only person who sees this, who saw how much potential the old world had that we just wasted.
Yes. A lot of it is a matter of perspective because I like this perspective. You take it back in the other direction and you
Yeah,
think of what would these people do if they saw this? Like if they got a tractor in ancient Mesopotamia when they were first digging ditches,
yeah,
like they would go crazy with that thing and it would be awesome. And so it's not, and so we look at it and we're like, oh, it's like just stuff, but that's because we've already had the life sucked up out of us by other things, like the frost, like you mentioned. If we
yeah.
didn't have the life sucked out of us, all this stuff would be awesome because we'd be able to put it towards very interesting, awesome things that we wanted to do. So it's not, and like, because people find this correlation between development and meaninglessness as if like having cool stuff means that you have no meaning, but they're confusing like bureaucracy and destroyed society with just stuff. Like if you're in space traveling from planet to planet doing crazy stuff, like there's a lot of meaning. Like you don't even have to go to space. You can transform things within your environment in a way that's incredibly meaningful. But we're not doing that for various reasons because of blue pill, oligarchy, whatever. And so then people have no meaning and they look at the stuff and they're like, it's not enough. Well, no, it's not enough, but it's part of it's this false dichotomy of stuff means meaninglessness.
I will say this and then we'll return to the topic. But The grocery stores around me regularly serve rotting food. I find it very disturbing. I've stopped shopping at
Especially the meat.
the meat's really
Yeah.
bad. I've had to uh I've had to I've thrown up like 6 times in the last few months from bad food. I've had to throw like 30 things in the last few months. Um and it's just I consistently do not shop at the major grocery stores because they'll have blackened meat at the counter. Um, it's already black when you're buying it. You open it up and it's rotting.
It's
And
rotflation. Normally, like they make the meat smaller or they raise the price. Now they're just selling it a little later.
and yeah, it's the worst I've seen. And I started only shopping at farmers markets and like places like Sprouts that source from certain farms. And I remember eating like the food again, and compared to the stuff at the grocery store, I thought this tastes what real food used to be like. 15 years ago, when I'd eat, it tasted like real food. And I thought what we do now is the symbolic equivalent of the sort of rotting, pallid, I see these sort of like glimmers of fat and chemicals and plastic in
Hmm.
sort of watery soup around the chicken. Um, I see that and it
Hmm.
freaks me out. And what we do now is that chicken compared to like the farmer's market real chicken.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's like toxic and dying, has the life sucked out of it. And it's super unnecessary because we could precisely the stuff that we're talking about that is meaningless, if it was legal, could be used to create supply chains with awesome chicken that was as available as crappy chicken. Like all of that is easily possible. It would have happened already if it wasn't being held back.
Literally, the only thing you have to do is get rid of regulations in
That's
DEI.
it.
And
Yeah, it's really simple.
we have many other cultural issues. But making sure that
Hmm.
we're not eating rotting food, we would just need
Yeah,
to have
Joel Salad. Hmm.
we would just need to have a system where we could correlate all of the local farmers in Texas, and we don't have to have a certified slaughterhouse, but the government, which kills local farmers, and then you just do it directly.
Yep.
And then you
Yeah,
get
Joel Salatin's chicken farm has is just like the best chickens ever, way less bacteria. The USDA tried to shut him down. He's like, all my metrics are better than your standards. What
yeah,
are you talking about?
these are evil days. Um, Back to
Yeah, but
1000
we're making progress on that.
1000 AD. Um, the region
Yeah.
was subdivided into these distinct kingdoms that gained independence um, and formed national identities at the exact same time. And 1000 AD was a general bellwether for when these societies around the world built out governments and functioning societies. That's what happened in France, formed around then as a sort of functioning society from the Franks. Germany did, England did, the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden did, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, the Sahel in Africa. 1000 AD was when the game map just grew like a DLC package. And in Eastern Europe, Poland formed as a country that was Catholic, almost exactly in 1000. The Hungarians had been a nomadic Turkic people from Central Asia that migrated into the region after the Franks had wiped out the Avars. And the Hungarians, or the Magyars, they conquered all the neighboring peoples, where historic Hungary is about twice the size of modern Hungary. And they raided out to France and Italy, and they were originally defeated by the new German Empire with Otto. And afterwards, the Hungarians had to turn inward and they converted to Catholicism. That was in 1000, and the Rus converted a little bit before then, I think. And so you saw these concert of states in Eastern Europe between the Byzantines and the Balkans, the Poles, the Hungarians, and the Rus. And the rest were tribes. The Baltic region was still tribes. Finland were tribes. The Ukrainian grassland were tribes. And the Turks were the peoples who inhabited the steppe lands, while it was reindeer herders further north among the Lapps or the Ugrians and those people. And it's easier to think this era was more peaceful than it was. I was reading this Osprey military history about uh, about medieval Poland because I was curious at the topic, and apparently, the Germans invaded Poland nearly every year in the 12th century. I was reading all the records. German invasion of Poland, 1193. German invasion of Poland, 1194. German invasion of Poland, 1196. German invasion of
Yeah.
Poland, 1196, number two. And so it's easy to look at a time period like this and think that because the borders are static, it's peaceful, but because this is the Middle Ages, it's constant low-level warfare. And Eastern Europe was bloodier than Western Europe. Medieval England had a murder rate comparable to modern South Africa, and Eastern Europe was even bloodier. And when you see these countries, you have to imagine them as sort of as weak creations earlier on, where Poland, as an example, collapsed into into different warlords in the 13th century after being unified for 200 years. And the Hungarians had several periods where they could not maintain power because a lot of the Hungarian governance was split between these sort of semi nomad peoples and then the monarchy and then the nobility because Hungary is a mix of grassland and forest. So all of these distinct factions vie against each other, where some Magyars were more nomadic, others had settled in the cities. Then they had perhaps a majority of the population of the Kingdom of Hungary were non-Hungarians, and then they had to subdue them. And you saw the Croats, for example, they formed a duchy which Hungary then conquered, and they were part of the Kingdom of Hungary, although they had some identity. And the Hungarians went into Romania, taking a majority of it with Transylvania, and Transylvania was an ethnic mix. But when you think of how weak medieval governments are, it's even more so in Eastern Europe, which created weird dynamics where most peasants in Eastern Europe were free, which meant they were significantly freer than the serfs in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. But at the same
Hmm.
time, you had sort
Free to
of,
get raided.
yeah, you get raided and all turned into slaves. Or your
Right.
lord is not really a nice guy and turns you into slaves. It was a wild.
It's more like Bug's Life, where like in Bug's Life, the bugs are technically free, but the grasshoppers still show up once a year to tax them. It's just not through an official process. It's like how poorly is your gold hidden?
I never saw that movie growing up. Um,
What? Bug's Life? That's
so
an absolute
my
iconic.
my mom banned like all modern cinema. We didn't have so we lived in the countryside. We didn't have TV. We didn't have internet, and it was just my mom's CDs. So I would just like I never saw SpongeBob. I never saw children's TV. Didn't watch the Disney Channel. It was just like my mom's CDs she kept lying around, and my mom had eclectic interests.
Like music CDs or
No,
videos,
my
DVDs.
mom would have like BBC document. Like, she'd have like BBC
Oh, sure.
or like
The Civil War documentary
or
or
like North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, or like she'd have like French cinema. My mom was like culturally elevated was one of her
hmm
benefits, although she had many negatives. And so that's part of the reason why I am the way I am. I grew up in the countryside, nearest neighbors were miles away. Just with the
Those things are awesome. When you first see your first like documentary on Rome, like I
yeah,
saw one when I was 11, and I was like, this is just amazing. It was the most basic documentary ever.
yeah.
Uh,
Um,
but it's awesome. Yeah, I didn't have TV either, cartoons, but I had movies.
yeah, we had a similar upbringing in that manner, but I'm trying to avoid these videos being 3 hours. It's been like a consistent goal of mine. They're getting too
We're
long.
just chatting
This
now.
is
We're
this
gonna
is
hang out after, so
this is
we can
good.
stop chatting.
My mental register cannot sustain more than what we're currently doing. Um, but Poland, Czechia, so weak centralized governments. Russia fell into principalities, and the Holy Roman Empire started pushing west again, where there was a period called the Wendish Crusade, where the Holy Roman Empire did ethnic replacement against the Slavs, where the area of modern Berlin was inhabited by the Wends. And the Wends are still the genetics of like a third of Brandenburg. A lot of Germans did migrate in, but it was near complete cultural replacement. And there were several Wends who were left. The final ones died around The final ones died around World War II due to the Nazis, and they're actually a Wendish community in
Wow.
Texas as a sort of adjunct to the fairly large Czech community in Texas. And so you saw the creation of this German colonial movement that would keep pushing outwards, as well as the integration of Bohemia into the empire. In Bohemia, or modern Czechia, they formed as a distinct empire in the 9th century under Wenceslaus, like the Christmas song, where Wenceslaus was a great king, and and he built out the Bohemian state, and then they were integrated in with the Holy Roman Empire as a respected partner. They were an independent kingdom. The Germans were not allowed to exert authority over them, and they were given the only honorary monarchy within the Holy Roman Empire. So Bohemia was a monarchy distinct from the rest of the Holy Roman Empire's identities. And it's a
Why'd
weird,
they get an exception?
because they were a distinct ethnic group and kingdom that
Oh,
it's
okay.
like Scotland with Britain. Because they had done it that way, Scotland could maintain legal independence. And then the rest of Germany could not be a monarchy because it was the Kingdom of Germany. And so if anyone inside that tried to break away, it would insult the honor of the Kingdom of Germany. But because Bohemia had already been distinct, there was no honor violation.
Got it.
And
Simple.
yeah, welcome to feudal politics. Ends in the year 1517. And Bohemia was part of this system where, although they were legally independent, they were dependent on German migrants. And so by the time of the Hussite Wars in the 15th century, the cities of Bohemia were entirely German until the 19th century. Their academic institutions were German dominated. A lot of their clergy was, as was much of the nobility. And so in the 15th century, the Czechs were starting to develop their own nationalism, where they were in this weird relationship with Germany, and they thought that their identity was getting destroyed. And the Hussites were the initial Protestants. They were 60 to 70 years were the other Protestants. And they they rebelled against the Catholic authorities, and they were very innovative. Where Bohemia, and this has really been written out, they were one of the more impressive places in Europe. They were one of the wealthiest places. They were one of the centers of philosophic breakthroughs, where Galileo was based in Bohemia for a little bit. I believe Copernicus was. A lot of the developers of early science, John Dee was based
Really?
there. Yeah, it was a huge intellectual center. And
And the original Protestants, because they were kind of like separate, so it was easy for them to separate from the Catholic Church.
Bohemia is next to Saxony, and Martin Luther was
Uh-huh.
Saxon. And it's the middle of Europe. And so that's why Bohemia converted to Protestantism. It's why they had Marxist influences. It's why they had early science. Because the Bohemians are or were equivalently to more technically skilled than the Germans at certain points. And then they were at the middle of Europe, and they were the furthest east manifestation of sort of Western civilization's core area, where they were
It
the
was like a Singapore, and how Singapore
yeah,
and Asia, we are allowed to do stuff there, so everybody does
yeah.
stuff there.
And there's a video game called Kingdom Come Deliverance set in 15th century Bohemia that's pretty cool. And so Bohemia's in the middle of it, and they're the most atheist country in the world due to that. Because they got the sort of ideological cynicism, partly because Catholicism was shoved down their throat. And these Bohemian Hussites rebelled. This was partially a justification for war against the Germans to drive them out, because there was definitely the ethnic component. The Czechs were trying to get these elite positions that the Germans had built, and the Czechs were using wagon circles in musket warfare. They were the first pioneers of musket warfare, and they were able to wipe out German field army after German field army until they gained independence, and the Catholic Church negotiated they were allowed to be Protestants peacefully. And this was 70 years before the Protestant Reformation.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
This is a super important little piece that I don't know how I missed, but it's almost like Germans blame Bohemians as a scapegoat because I don't think a lot of this stuff was really necessarily Hussite culture. It sounds like because it was an independent territory, it became the what do you call it? The valve, escape valve for European intellectuals and Protestants to go try stuff before they were allowed to, and the rest of it. And that culture got ascribed as Bohemian, even though it had really nothing to do with the Hussites.
Bohemian's different. So the term Bohemian is from 19th century France, and it's a synonym for sort of gypsy slash Eastern European, because in 19th century France, you had these Eastern European ghetto communities, and the Bohemians were artists who lived in these cheap ghettos because they were affordable. So they conflated the degeneracy of the artists with the degeneracy of these Eastern European ghettos and called them les bohèmes.
Oh, fascinating. So that kind of term is the way Bohemian as a term got picked up is kind of loosely related as a kind of a vague reference of Eastern Europeans, but it also fits with the ethos of this kind of
Yeah.
free city,
Yeah.
right? So,
And the Bohemians did go through degenerate phases. We ascribe sort of moral Puritanism to everything pre-1960s, which is insane because you had very degenerate periods in like the 16th and the 17th centuries or the Middle Ages.
yeah,
Um,
taverns and
yeah.
maids and all that. Yeah.
So, and the other thing as well is that you had the formation of these nations over the medieval period. And after the Black Death, which Poland escaped the Black Death for reasons because Poland was not part of trade routes, so it just didn't have the effects, which is why Poland was able to conquer so much of the neighboring area after because they didn't have the same hit. Eastern Europe fell into serfdom, and serfdom was less bad in Czechia than in the rest of Eastern Europe, which is partly why they were freer. Where in Poland, in Brandenburg, and Prussia, and even Austria, Hungary, Russia, serfdom became really bad. And as I've said many times before, because it's true, East European serfdom is more comparable to American slavery than West European serfdom because the landlord had total authority over his serfs. He could do anything to them and completely control them and manipulate them and sell them off or whatever, work them all
It's
day.
like Roman slavery, yeah,
Yes.
instead of serfdom.
So when you're looking at, let's say, Poland and Russia, which are two countries that are culturally and linguistically close, they're very divided by civilization and by religion and by social structure. Poland is
Poland's
individual.
an interesting one.
Yeah, Poland, there's a lot of stuff going on in Poland, and
Hmm.
Russia is Asiatic and collectivist and orthodox. But both of them were serf societies. So it's an interesting
Hmm.
microcosm where both of them had really bad serfdom. Poland's nobility was democratic and locally based, where Poland's developed a parliament that was the freest of anywhere in the world, and it was run by the Slocha, and the Slocha was the Polish parliament, where about 12% of the population, which was the largest suffrage of anywhere on earth at the time, way more than Britain, and the nobility gained a complete throttle on Poland. Same thing as Hungary, where
Right.
in their nation building phase, because Eastern Europe hit their population tipping point after the Black Death. And by that point, Eastern Europe was connected with Western Europe through a trade system where as Eastern Europe became more populous, they felt the same pressures towards freedom or slavery, but because the towns were less powerful and there was this trade connection to West Europe, the landlords enslaved the peasants to keep control of their labor supply in a lightly populated area, which created huge downstream effects because it enserfed their population, made them permanently economically dependent on Western Europe, where I think Eastern Europe has like 10% of the economic size, if you take out Russia, of Western Europe.
Mm.
A staggering difference. And so
I'd probably leave Russia in.
it kept Eastern Europe poor. It stopped their population development in a way that didn't have to. Where Poland, if it was a democratic, free capitalist society, it could have had America's demographic pressures because the Poles were up against the Ukrainian grassland where they could have gone to Asia.
Hmm.
And so if Poland was a free
Hmm.
society, and free societies have radically
Hmm.
higher birth rates than slave societies, it could have had the Anglo-American thing where you have 10 kids and then another 10 kids, and then the Poles could have steamrolled Russia, assimilated the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians as they nearly did, and then gone out to China. And that didn't happen.
Ironic. Mhm.
It's very
The Germans probably handicap them a little bit, and it's interesting because it seems like Poland is serving a similar role as Bohemia in that it's like a Slavic population that's kind of encased more within Western culture, so they're not limited by the societal trends of the West, but they can still pick up the info. So if things were going crazy in Germany, that might be like Poland's a good refuge for good are the good Western ideas to
yeah.
form, and it kind of shows you that yeah, like the Slavs could have gone this way in Eastern Europe as well if they are in Western Europe. And right now, Poland, I think, is competing with Germany on some economic metrics in a way that they have never done in their entire history. So,
Eastern Europe's really interesting because there's these there's all of these dynamics where Poland culturally, economically similar to Russia, where in values, in religion, in constitution, in these other things, Poland is a Western country. And on most anthropological metrics, Poland is way closer to Western Europe than it is to Russia because it has the core values of Western civilization. And you can see this
mhm.
Poland regularly producing democracies, caring about freedom, where the Poles were the freest people in Eastern Europe, and they consistently fought for their own freedom. And Poland has consistently been my favorite country in this region of the world.
Fascinating. And every time they try and get free, Germany kind of shuts them down. And I don't, it's not working this time with the EU. Not that Poland's never on the negative side of the trends, but I feel like they never, it's hard for them to break away from the rest of Europe.
They've made a few incorrect choices over their history. They didn't have to be the sort of middle country between Russia and Germany, where they formed first around 1000 AD, then they um, split up into independent countries, and then they had to fight the Teutonic Knights. And through going up against the Teutonic Knights, they reunified, married Lithuania, and Lithuania was the last pagan nation in Europe. They converted to Christianity in the early 15th century, and they worshiped the old sort of, they were Baltic peoples, they
Hmm.
worshiped sort of East European gods like Peruna. Peruna is the Slavic Thor, who's the head of their pantheon. And with the
Hmm.
integration of Lithuania, because Lithuania was the biggest country in Europe, and it stretched down to the Black Sea, because after the fuck, this is nearer we had to do chronologically. As the Mongol Empire fell, Lithuania conquered the Ukrainian regions of the Mongol Empire that the Khanate of the Golden Horde wasn't able to hold, and through that, they became the biggest country in Europe with these large populations of Rusin who they had cowed. And Poland, through marrying into Lithuania against the Teutonic Knight threat, they integrated modern Belarus and Ukraine under Polish culture, where the Lithuanian ruling class became completely enmeshed with the Polish ruling class. The Poles then overextended themselves, started bullying the Orthodox people too much, making them resentful, and they attacked Russia and Moscow, seizing Moscow briefly. And they were fighting the Turks down by the south. They were up in the on the frontier, and then the Russians pressed them back south, and the Prussians allied with the Ukrainians. And from that point onwards, Poland became a joke of a country because Poland's constitution was so democratic that it gave the leader no power, where the king was often because Poland had killed its king, where Hungary as well established its own Magna
Hmm.
Carta at the same time. So Hungary had as many legal freedoms as England's did in the Middle Ages. And in Poland, they were so free and democratic that the king and central government had no authority, which was really an issue in that area of the world because you have to use authoritarian power over the military in order to maintain sort of the rigid militaristic hierarchy necessary for the constant wars. And the Polish Slacha made a rule that if any person on their ruling council said no to a law, they would not pass it because they were hyper libertarian conservative. So their attitude,
Fascinating.
as if the US government had a position where if anyone tried to pass a new law, it would immediately be invalidated if one person said no. So there would be no new laws because our old legal structure is so perfect at preserving freedom that we're not
Yeah.
going to change it. And so what
It's like the
happened?
blue slip tradition.
What would happen is that the neighboring governments would just bribe one of these councilmen so that nothing was accomplished in Poland-Lithuania. And Poland-Lithuania had this
Hmm.
significant area, the largest country in Europe for a lot of this period besides Russia, uh, of East Central Europe, that all of the neighboring countries would just walk over Poland, Lithuania, they'd march armies through, they'd bribe it. And when Poland, Lithuania actually tried to renovate and make themselves not a joke at the end of the 18th century, Austria,
Hmm.
Russia, and Prussia subdivided them because their survival was
Right.
solely contingent on them being useless.
Mm. That, I mean, it wasn't a bad idea because they're taking some of these trends towards freedom that's like, hey, this is going to work. But the problem is, like you said, not only are you surrounded in the middle of the map, but if you try to go free, then you're going to you get rid of your monarchy and you maybe break a cartel, whatever. You're going to have a huge target on your back because there's going to be economic consequences to that affect the neighboring countries. It might affect the culture if they see your reforms are successful. And so they like try to turn a light on in the middle of the ocean. It got electrocuted.
Yeah. It's
You got to get on a hill before you start with a light. Make sure maybe get across the ocean, build the light, get that fire going, and get well.
I My favorite history of Poland is Adam Zamoyski's history, and he's from one of Poland's great noble families. He's an incredible writer. He wrote the best Napoleon biography too. And I read this during COVID when I went on a huge reading binge. I was nearly crying at the end of the dismembering of Poland because I was just looking at how the Poles were resisting the neighboring countries, and they fought back and they reindustrialized and they put in a democratic constitution modeled off America. Their leader
Hmm.
had fought in the American Revolution already with Washington. They had built up a fort system. They established a free market system just to get utterly dismembered by all the neighbors. And you just think, what could Poland have been?
Yeah. They're like, but I did all the right things. Yeah,
Yeah.
they had great ideas. They're just in a bad spot for it. But
Um,
that's why now they have huge potential and they are surging. Like Eastern Europe has potential. Poland is living it right now.
yeah, I have faith in Poland's future.
Poland's golden age.
The issue that region, I'm going to say this too. Poland is one of the great centers of the Italian Renaissance. The nobility there
Wow.
OD'd on Renaissance culture in a way that almost no one else in Europe did. And Poland was also one of the most tolerant nations in Europe, where their parliament nearly converted to Protestantism because so many of them were Protestants, because Poland had near complete religious tolerance. Um,
Mm.
the Jews migrated into the region because Poland was so tolerant. In the late 14th century, and they were kicked out of Western Europe. And a majority of the world's Jews lived within Poland, Lithuania, and the Poles would use the Jews against the Ukrainians as tax collectors and bankers. And that was part of the merchant middleman minority we should get to. Um, and the issue a lot of Eastern Europe had was the nobility got too powerful, where in the era of commercial agriculture, where Eastern Europe's most important export was grain, from out to Western Europe, where a lot of the cities like Amsterdam or London or Paris were dependent on these Eastern European grain supplies in the early modern period. So when Denmark cut off the trade with Eastern Europe, it sparked the English Civil War in the Fronde because the people just couldn't eat. And so this put
Mm.
the noblemen in a position of profound power. And in Poland, the noblemen dismembered every other element of the society. Where Poland was not a capitalist society because 80+% of people were serfs, the nobility kept it artificially poor and pre-industrial. And with this huge phase of Sarmatian obsession, I have a whole rant. I read this book by this Tsarist Russian reactionary nobleman who was writing a history of Russia pre-World War One. He was part of this school of saying that the
Mm.
Slavs were Scythians, and so the Polish
Right.
nobility in the 17th century would dress like they were Iranian and Persian to say that we are truly Scythians and the lower classes are a different ethnicity from us. That's a high level LARP.
Yeah, I was literally gonna call it a LARP, but I wasn't sure if it's the right word. They're like
Yeah.
dressing
So
up with turbans and gold and like, yeah, we're
yeah,
hot shit.
as a side note, the history I read of the Russian reactionary nobleman's history of Russia was insane. Where he would say like the Slavs are the same as the Scythians, they're native to Eastern Europe, and you talk about the Russians being
Like, bro, you're a Slav.
like the Russians are God's chosen people, and they learned from the Greeks, and the Slavs are relatives of the Greeks, and they gain civilization from them. Then he just goes into all
Oh,
these
okay.
heroic epics from the Kievan Rus, and then pretends they're actual history. And so the entire like 200 pages is like, and then the noble bearing of Yaroslav the Great was so grand that he seduced a princess, and then he arm wrestled his companion who killed him. And
Right.
it's
And he
weird.
conquered them because he was manly and they wanted a man to
Yeah,
help.
it's that narrative. He literally wrote that in, and so it's weird to see that in an industrialized country. And this guy was one of the top noblemen in one of those Imperial Russian organizations. And this was the standard narrative of Tsarist Russian history. Um,
It's kind of memey. It's kind of like fun. It's kind of good lore. Like well, that reminds me of the guy you said that I didn't know Tolkien's was inspired by that. What was it? Finnish Chronicle? Which all the way back then when that Finnish thing was written, it was expressly written to kind of create a lore for their people, which was I thought Tolkien's idea. But if he's drawing inspiration from that Finnish story, he's probably also drawing inspiration. That probably gave him the idea for why it was important to write a lore in the first place.
So, national epic myths are a consistent thread across every society, and people consciously create them. The Aeneid was written 1,000 years after Homer, and
Mm,
when Rome was already a quote modern society, and they stopped believing in the myths. They sort of they gathered one together from their history that they could believe. The and Charlemagne is another version, and you America doesn't have a national myth or a national epic, but most societies do, and they often form
mm.
organically. I mean, the Portuguese formed one for their Indian Ocean colonies in the 16th century, the Lusiads. Um, but the nobility gained such a chokehold on East Central Europe that they stopped its development. And Hungary was similar, where they were one of the great states of medieval Europe, consistently maybe in the top three or four most powerful countries in Europe. And they fought against the Turks. They would launch pretty effective crusades periodically, and they could really hold their own. They stopped being a unified monarchy because in the 15th century, their king was trying to make a professional military, which I think he called the Ironsides. McNeill has a good book about this. And they shut off that king and his line. Then the nobility installed a weak king, which was a consistent threat in this region of the world where they'd often bring in foreign kings who would not have local loyalties. And the nobility utterly throttled Hungary, keeping it as a sort of primitive society. And Hungary was super diverse between a lot of ethnicities, a lot of economic styles. But a lot of rural Hungary might as well have been Brazil or a third world country, even though it was in Europe. A lot of the Hungarian grassland was not populated until the 18th century when the Austrians went on a very explicit process of colonization. Um, and they would bring in peoples like Serbs or Croats or Germans to populate Hungary. And so that was what weakened Hungary and allowed the Ottomans to conquer it, where the Ottomans steamrolled Hungary after taking it at the Battle of Mohawks. And Hungary was an Ottoman possession until the late 17th century when the Austrians conquered it.
Right, that's really recent. That's quite a bit after
Yeah.
gunpowder and like English Civil War even.
To go through a few other trajectories, the Germans were a force from the West, and Germany had developed faster in the High Middle Ages, so they had a growing population, and they would send settlers out along the Baltic coastline, where all of Poland's north coast became ethnically German, and the Germans also populated Prussia, which is an area currently controlled by Russia, that juts out to the eastern bank of the Baltic. And this area was all unpopulated swamps populated by Baltic peoples. And the Germans brought a higher level of culture. They were quite industrious. And it was free German settlers, often from areas like the Netherlands or Frisia or even England, who would populate this Baltic coastline. And this later became the foundation of the Teutonic Knights and the Prussians. And the Prussians were one of the greatest empires in European history, where the Teutonic Knights were a military formation originally from Jerusalem, who fought against the Arabs as the knights. As I think they protected the sacred mountain. They were monk warriors, and when the Holy Land was lost to the Muslims, they first moved to Hungary in Transylvania to fight against the Turkic Cuman peoples of the Ukrainian grassland. And then they migrated up to Prussia in Riga, up by Latvia. And Latvia was beforehand controlled by an organization called the Brothers of the Sword, who were Scandinavian monks who conquered Latvia. And Latvia had not been earlier conquered by the Vikings. It was a pagan Baltic people. And the Teutonic Knights conquered Latvia and Estonia, as well as Prussia. And they did so through this it was called Teutonic because they're mostly ethnically German. And they would conquer the region, build these beautiful red brick castles, and then subdue the
Oh,
local
interesting.
population, turning them into serfs. And the ruling nobility of the German Empire until World War II were called the Junkers. Junker is a term for young Herr, where these young Herr, German for young lord, they started in Germany. They didn't have a title back there, where they were a second and a third son. Then they'd go out to Prussia or the Baltic, and they would establish themselves as a new nobility. So they were a young lord, a young lordly line. So you would differentiate the old German nobility versus the new upstart nobility. And they had quite strong social cohesion, where the Baltic Germans were often the ruling group in the Imperial Russian military under the Tsar, descendants of the Teutonic Knights. And the Junkers in Prussia were the population that unified the rest of Germany later, where these German colonies in Poland and the Baltic became
Mm,
the Prussian state that was the nucleus of
mm.
the reconquest of the rest of Germany. And Prussia was a serf state like the rest of Eastern Europe, with this highly draconian, militaristic, um, uh, really tough leadership class.
Right. It's the opposite of Europe and the US. It'd be like if Europe's diaspora went to the US and then got more powerful and then conquered them and made them more authoritarian, which is what we did, except we kind of made them more free a little bit. Not really. I mean, we're getting there.
There's a lot of similar dynamics.
Similar though. It's mhm.
There's a lot of similar dynamics of freedom and slavery. It's just slavery and authoritarianism won out in Eastern Europe, and freedom won out here. Black slavery and
Right.
the Spanish serf plantations were our manifestation of bondage, uh, bondage
Hmm.
versus freedom. And you see those trajectories on frontiers because when you have a low population density, the logic is either um, force everyone who's there to work for you or let everyone be free.
Interesting the volatility in that, how
Yeah.
it can produce like opposite responses, the frontier being it.
McNeill has a really brilliant book called Europe Steppe Frontier 1500 to 1800. And it's one of those topics where you get an A tier historian who makes a book on a region of the world you would otherwise have not studied, and that just ignites your interest in the topic, where he talks about each of these societies to
Mhm.
the function of what social structures they had. Um, and so the Germans had a wide-scale migration across Eastern Europe during the medieval period. And it was because they had a higher level of civilization where they were more literate, they were harder working, came from a capitalist society, um, and all those things where the Germans became a majority along the Baltic and Silesia in Poland. But you had German populations in Transylvania, in Romania, you had German populations in Hungary, they were a majority in a lot of Czechia. Then you had Germans out in Ukraine, and under the Czars, there were Germans who migrated to the Volga, and then those Germans later migrated to the upper Midwest, and then Germans down by Crimea. And the Germans were instrumental in a lot of governance and trading and that stuff because they were invited by the local monarchies, where these middlemen minorities like the Germans or the Jews or the Greeks or the Armenians, who were all pivotal and important in this region, where the Slavs were never the merchant or the bureaucrat or the literate classes. The Slavs were the nobility and the peasants. And these groups, like the Germans, the Jews, the Armenians, and the Greeks, they were the sort of intermediary middle classes. And so the Jews were most concentrated in sort of Ruthenia in eastern Poland. They migrated in the 14th century and lived in these ghettos completely distinct from everywhere else. They were never a majority anywhere and often horribly repressed. The Greeks were the dominant merchant class in Romania and Bulgaria. And the Greeks were the dominant merchant class of the Ottoman Empire. So wherever the Ottomans went to a place, they'd use the Greeks as their sort of henchmen. And then the Armenians were biggest in Russia, where the Armenians had a trade network that stretched from
Mm,
Scandinavia to India. And the Armenians were the dominant merchant class in India through the 18th century.
interesting. I wonder if that got created any of their conflicts with the Turks,
Yes. The
because the
Turks,
Turks were fighting the Russians.
the Turks, so it very much did, because the Russians played with the Armenians and the Georgians because they were Orthodox Christians, and so they could always use the Armenians and the Georgians against the Ottoman Turks. And the Turks
Hmm.
got tired of it and genocided them.
Right. And where were the Russians when that happened?
The Russians
Playing in
were
the
in the middle.
snow.
They were in the middle of a civil war.
There you go. I guess that was why they waited for the right time, the Turks did.
Yeah,
Very sneaky.
I have some stories from Turkey. The Turks are not apologetic. Um,
That's funny. Yeah, well,
we're
crap.
not
Yeah,
going to
Young
get into
Turks.
it. We've had like 10. We've had 10 tangents. Tangents.
Tangerines.
And so you have these middlemen minorities and the pressure from the West. And so now we've talked about the formation of Hungary, Poland, the Germans and the Teutonic states, Ukraine, and then the two external forces that we have not yet discussed are the Mongols and the Turks. And the Mongols came in from the east in the 13th century like a storm, where they just wrecked the region. There was nothing that was comparable beforehand. The Vikings were able to sort of keep a boundary against the other steppe peoples, where the Cumans and the Pechenegs were bad, but they were not the supernova that the Mongols were, where the Mongols incorporated all of the nomadic peoples of the Western steppe into a new Mongol ethnic identity. And so the Crimean Tatar people of Ukraine, they would call themselves Mongols through the 18th century. The
Mm.
Khazar people, who the Russians fought against until the 16th century, they were also Mongols. And
Wow.
and even though most of the armies that the Tatars used against European Russia were ethnic Turks, they identified as Mongol. And so a lot of these people would have looked identical to white people. If you look at the Volga Khazars, because there's multiple Khazars, the Volga Khazars, they're lily white. Um, and and that's Mongol is like a cultural identity, not a pure racial one, much like Latin is. And the Mongols decimated Russia. Russia was the place in the Mongol Empire that they treated the worst, and they would periodically burn cities down. They would utterly devastated the region, and they totally changed its structure. Where the reason Moscow gained dominance over the rest of Russia is that they were an edge state of the Kievan Rus. They were on the far frontier, and they weren't even populated till the 10th century, where they were on the sort of semi-nomadic fringe, and they were a minor barony. And under the Tatars, as they were called, um, Moscow was given the taxing ability of the rest of the Russia because it was unimportant. And then Moscow used this to develop the loyalty of these other Russian states until Tamerlane had weakened the Golden Horde or the European Mongol territory enough that the Russians could declare independence in 1481.
And they used the centralization through Moscow to pick out the Mongols,
Yes.
like their own weapon again, their own organization, which is ironic because they originally failed to push them off because of the failure to organize. The Mongols set them up through Moscow and fixed their error, and that got rid of the Mongols. But it also left Russia with an altered structure, which would have been better if they had changed it themselves, probably.
Russia took a huge hit from this, where the new Russia was completely disconnected from the West, where it used to be that Anglo-Saxons served in the Kievan Rus or the Varangian Byzantine Guard. Um, so there were plenty of Anglo-Saxons in Kievan Rus, where there was even an Anglo-Saxon colony in Crimea of people fleeing the Battle of Hastings. But the English had to rediscover Russia under Queen Elizabeth because they were that cut off, and the Russians had become serfs and
Wow.
totally disconnected from other societies. You'll hear stories of even the wealthiest Russian nobility wearing sort of animal furs into the 16th century because they had no connection to finer linens, where a few Italian architects went out to Russia in the 15th century to build the
Hmm.
Kremlin. And that was like worlds colliding, where such as Marco Polo going to China. And even earlier on, Russia was uh, pretty open and outward thinking, where it was a medieval society, where Russia was nearly Brazil. Um, but Ivan the Great was the figure who gained Russian independence from the Mongols, and this occurred roughly around the time of Christopher Columbus. And that was a brutal war, it took many years. And he declared Russia the third Rome through marrying a Byzantine princess. And
Hmm.
the Russia and Muscovy were the same thing. It was a city state around Moscow with the neighboring areas, and then they killed Novgorod, which was a merchant republic in North Russia, and they burned it to the ground, which matters.
Swedish coded.
Yes, where Novgorod was a parliamentary democracy, it was run by the merchant classes. There was a Russian saying, Novgorod is our father, Kiev is our mother, Moscow is our heart, and St. Petersburg is our head.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so wiping out Novgorod brought Russia in a different direction, and it also shows that Russia could have been something different. Novgorod was well known for Alexander Nevsky, who was their leader who fought off the Teutonic Knights in the 13th century. And there's an interesting Soviet film with one of the best battles in film history about lake. There's a lake between Estonia and Russia where they killed, like, not near Pskov, but it's not Pskov. There's a lake battle in the 13th century over the ice between the Teutonic Knights and Novgorod, and the Novgorod forces won, which was the great accomplishment of Alexander Nevsky's career. Well, he had earlier submitted to the Mongols, and Novgorod was the only Russian state that survived the Mongol tyranny as just a client state, and then Muscovy destroyed them. And Ivan the Terrible continued this trend through making the Russian nobility dependent on the ruler, not on the population, like they were in the rest of Europe. He created his own private military called the Streltsy, launched multiple purges against the population, and also made his own secret police called the Oprichnika. And so even in the 16th century, Russia was setting itself up to be the autocratic totalitarian state that would later evolve into. And so and Ivan the Terrible was also mentally ill. He would torture his children. But even at the time of Ivan the Terrible, Russia did not have a major coastline. It was a medieval society. And the Russians really made a good decision by working with the Cossacks, who were a free Slav pirate people, where the Mongols had gone a little further west, where, to backtrack a little bit, this entire era is a jumble, I am sorry. The Mongols made it out to, like, Czechia. They defeated Hungary, they defeated Poland and the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Liegnitz, and then their leader died out in Siberia. So they had to go back to have the Mongol Council, which saved Europe from Mongol conquest, although the Mongols beat the European militaries, and they made it out to nearly the Mediterranean or Germany. The Pope was considering launching a crusade against the Mongols.
Fascinating.
And so the Mongols were this near miss. What the Mongols did genocide Poland. They burnt all the cities in Slovakia. So there was collateral damage here. And part of the reason Poland grew was because they were defeated by the Mongols, but the Mongols did not devastate the cities of Poland. And with the fall of the Mongol Empire, the entire grassland region was depopulated because the nomads were hit especially hard by the Black Death. And so what happened was that the surviving Muslim state, the Khanate of Crimea, retreated back to the bottom of the Crimean Peninsula. The entire rest of the grassland was utterly depopulated, leaving it open, and then the Crimean Tatars would venture out from their fortress and then enslave millions of Slavs for the Turkish market, because they were an independent Turkish subsidiary state. And they were the last Mongol vestige state that survived into the end of the 18th century, where the Russians only took Crimea in the 1780s. And it was just this vortex of slavery and horror, where the Russians built their own version of the Great Wall against the Tatars, and it was almost an industrial scale operation. But it opened up all of these space where these Slavs who were escaping the rising serfdom of Eastern Europe, they formed these independent horse pirate republics on the South Ukrainian grassland that were the people who populated Siberia. And the Cossacks initially worked with the Poles because they thought the Poles were freer. And then when the Poles tried to enserf them, they worked with the Russians under the contract that the Russians would keep them free. But then their own nobility betrayed them against the Russians after they had already worked with the Russians to defeat the Poles and ultimately conquer Poland and then conquer Siberia. So the Russian central government used the Cossacks' freedom until it was useful and then turned them into serfs.
Interesting. I love the term horse pirates.
Yeah,
I think we call that cowboy, but
so
so they killed the father in Novgorod, basically.
Yes. The
like
final
father analogy.
final country we have to cover is the Turks, and then we've established
Perfect.
Well, we have to cover the Austrians too. So Turks started in Anatolia. No, the Turks are their own video. I'm sorry. I can't get to do the Turks like this.
I think that makes sense.
So Austria. Um,
No offense.
the Habsburgs, they were from Switzerland and they were a minor noble family. And in the chaos of the German anarchy after the fall of the Hohenstaufen Central European Holy Roman Empire, um, they conquered Austria in a sort of good military campaign, moved their operations there. The disunited Holy Roman Empire voted the Austrians as emperors of the empire because they were weak enough they would not be a centralized authority. And so it was this weird situation where the Holy Roman Emperor was actually governor of Austria and Slovenia, but he could not actually control the territory he was legally governor of, or the Holy Roman Empire. And so all of his possessions were stuff he conquered outside of it. So the Austrian Habsburgs, they, for a certain period, had the Spanish Empire with its colonies across Latin America and in every continent. They would later conquer parts of Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, even over the medieval period, often conquered into Italy. And they even they even made it out to Austria, out to Hungary and Slovakia and Transylvania, and that was an area they conquered from the Turks in the mid to late 17th century. And the book that I'm currently reading, and this is a transition outwards to our next video on Eastern Europe's age of empires, as I've become significantly more positive in my view of the Austrian Habsburgs, because I used to see them as sort of like a less dynamic version of France or Prussia. But from the book I'm reading, written by Kumar, he instead portrays it as this was the highest level of civilization that the populations involved could have attained. He said you have 10 different subpopulations that has this country that's held together for centuries with the freest they've ever been, highest degree of industrialization and capitalism they ever had, highest degree of cultivation. And I had perceived the Austrians as weak, but I thought, wait, they've held that territory down for centuries. This was when this area was happiest and achieving the most. And they only make sense in a sort of Catholic frame because Austro-Hungary is this organic Catholic society of all of these sub-nations which agree to have this shared imperial ethos as the sort of organic society that doesn't really make sense with all of these sort of negotiated agreements. And it's sort of like the political version of the Catholic Church.
Interesting. Yeah, it's like German Catholicdom
Yes.
or something, that area. And it's like almost like water pocket in between Germany and Italy, where it's never like the main show, but it's always just in balance.
Yeah. For the final bit, the Balkans under the Turks, before the Turks in the medieval period, they went through a period of small nation building after the fall of the Byzantines, before the rise of the Turks. When Serbia briefly had a larger empire, they conquered into northern Greece. They've glorified that ever since. The Bulgarians did. Albania was Epirus, and they conquered into Greece. Um, and this has been widely glorified by the Balkan nations, the sort of historic vacuum they had for over a century. And then the Turks utterly conquered all of them. And so the Battle of Kosovo is something the Serbs obsess over because it was the last time they could have been a greater nation that conquered outwards. And instead, they were under centuries of Turkic governance where they had someone else to blame for their failings.
Makes sense.
So,
Is that most of the topics?
yeah, we're done. This video was it was hard to do. This was so many
Yeah.
minutes. God, I didn't even have a
Sorry for keeping your brain going more than 3 hours with the.
This isn't more
tangents.
than 3 hours. This is three and a two and what? This is 2.5 hours.
Or yeah, approaching the 3 hour mark.
Okay. Well,
Getting closer.
so follow your
Yeah.
dream. Follow,
Final thoughts. I just wanted to say how insane it is with the timeline of the Mongols because
yeah,
they killed and a lot of Europeans died from disease, like 50% Black Death or whatever.
yeah.
That's not that dissimilar or that far of a time difference between when the Americans began to be settled. It's like the same time period,
Yes, I have
pretty
said
much. It's wild, and it was, a lot of them died of disease. Even more died of disease, but it was followed up with population movements. Where the Mongols, it wasn't followed up with population movements. It would have had different kind of resistance, but it's just crazy that that's basically the same time.
yeah, I've said that before, where Vladivostok in Russian Siberia was populated at the same time as the U.S. Civil War. Um, the Russians only knocked out the last of the East European Caucasian tribal peoples at the time of the U.S. Civil War.
Yeah, that's wild, which has all sorts of interesting political implications. I would love to spend more time in Eastern Europe and learn more about it. And like, 'cause I feel like we're going to learn a lot about it and about humanity through how they develop. I think there's going to be some interesting insights. We're going to see all those little national cultures play out in their own way, and they'll all be interesting. It's kind of like when Age of Empires 2 did a civ expansion and they threw in like four Eastern European civs. It's like that's what it's going to be like. We're going to get to kind of experience those, I think, in an interesting way.
The rapper Pitbull once said, "I have the world in the palm of my hand. Wherever I touch it, that's where I land."
And he always lands in Miami.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, and then I guess just final, not thoughts on the video, but check out our merch store, buy our bookmark for fun, and check out my YouTube show. Ludwig Never Mises is the at, Austin Paget is the name. I just did an episode responding to Dave Smith on something that I thought was pretty interesting. So check that out if you are into it.
Sounds good. And I will see you next week for the Eastern Europe's Age of Empires.
Yes, I'll see you in an hour.
Bye bye.